Chapter 22. Chemical Warfare in Relation to Strategy and Tactics. Fundamentals of War. The underlying fundamental principles of chemical warfare are the same as for all other arms. Because of this, it is worthwhile, and even necessary, to understand the applications of chemical warfare, for us to go back and study the work of the masters in war from the dawn of history down to the present. When we do that, we find that the underlying fundamental principles of war remain unchanged. They are the same today as they were in the time of Demosthenes, and as they will be 10,000 years from now. It is an axiom that the basis of success in war is the ability to have at the decisive point at the decisive moment a more effective force than that of the enemy. This involves men and materials. It involves courage, fighting ability, and the discrimination and energy of the opposing commanders. Another fundamental is that no success is achieved without positive action. Passive resistance never wins. These are really unchanging fundamentals. We may also say that the vigor of attack, the speed of movement of men and supplies, and the thorough training of men in the use of the weapons of war are unchanging requirements. But outside of these, everything is subject to the universal law of change. Grecian phalanx and Roman legion. The last word in the development of human strength as a battle weapon was illustrated by the Grecian phalanx with its 16 rows of men, the spears of each row being so adjusted that all reached to the front line. That phalanx could not be stopped by any other human formation that met it face to face. To overcome it required a Roman legion that could open up and take the phalanx in the flank and rear. In the same way, the elephants of the Africans and the chariots of the Romans with their great swords swept all in front of them, until the Roman legion, opening up into smaller groups, allowed the elephants and chariots to pass through only to close in on them from the rear. Then and then only did those engines of war disappear forever. Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great, realizing that rapidity of fire would win on the fields of battle where he fought, trained his men to a precision of movement in close order probably never achieved by any other troops in the world, and then added to their efficiency by teaching them to load and fire muskets at double the rate of that of his adversaries. He was thus enabled to concentrate at the decisive points a preponderance of power, which swept all his enemies before him. Napoleon. Napoleon achieved the same decisive power in a different way. Realizing that his French troops could not stand the rigorous training that the Prussians underwent, he trained them to fight with great enthusiasm, to travel long distances with unheard of swiftness, and to strike the enemy where least expected. He added to that a concentration of artillery until then not thought of as possible on the field of battle. He, of course, had also a genius for organizing and keeping up his supply. Grant and Jackson. Grant at Vicksburg and Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley and at Chancellorsville, achieved the same results in different ways. In every case, the fundamental principle of concentrating the greatest force at the decisive point at the vital moment in the battle remained the same. The methods for achieving that end change with every age, and every commander of worldwide renown developed something new or used an old method in a new way. And that is the fundamental requirement for a successful general. Hannibal, Hasdrubal, Caesar, Napoleon, Frederick the Great, Scott, Grant, and Jackson were all independent thinkers. Each and every one dared to do something that every other general and statesman of his time told him could not be done or that would bring about disaster. They had the courage of their convictions. They had the courage to think out new ideas and to develop them, and then they had the courage to carry through those convictions, not alone against the opposition of the enemy, but against the opposition of their own people, both in the field and at home. And we may be perfectly sure that in each case, had these men not done the things they did, they would have gone down to oblivion, just as has been the case with millions of others who tried the usual methods in the usual way. Chemical warfare latest development. Chemical warfare is the latest development of war. So far as the United States is concerned, it is considerably less than 4 years old. It is the most scientific of all methods of fighting and also the most universally applicable to all other methods of making war. The use of poisonous and irritating gases in war is just as fundamental as the introduction of gunpowder. In fact, they have an even wider application to war than powder itself. Necessity for new methods. The idea that has been expressed above is that the General Staff and the Army Commander who sticks to old and tried methods and who is unwilling to try with all his might new developments, will never achieve any first-class success. The General Staffs and the generals of the future that win wars will be the ones who make the most vigorous and efficient use of chemical warfare materials. They cannot confine this use to the artillery, to aviation, to special gas troops, or to any other single branch of the war machine. They must make use of it in every way. What is meant by gas? It must be understood that by gases we refer to materials that injure by being carried to the victim in the air. The word gas has nothing whatever to do with the condition of the material when in the shell, or the bombs, or the cylinders before released. In every case, the gases are liquids or solids. When the containers are broken open, the liquids are volatilized either by the gas pressure or by the force of the explosion of the bomb. Groups of gases. Chemical warfare gases are divided into three great groups. So far as their actual tactical use on the field of battle is concerned, there are only two groups, persistent and non-persistent. The third is the irritant group. This group affects the eyes and the lungs so as to make the victim very uncomfortable if not completely incapable of action in quantities so small as to cause no injury that lasts more than a few hours. The quantities of such gases needed to force the wearing of the mask is superscript 1/ that needed to cause the same discomfort by the really poisonous gases, such as phosgene. They, therefore, have a very great economic value in harassing the enemy by forcing him to wear masks and to take other precautions against gas. And no matter how perfect gas masks and gas-proof clothing become, their long-continued use will cut down physical vigor in an ever-increasing ratio until in 2 or 3 days an army may be totally incapacitated. Smoke. In chemical warfare materials we have another great group which will probably be equal in the future to the three groups just mentioned. That is common smoke. Smoke has a variety of uses. By the simple term smoke is meant smokes that are not poisonous or irritating. Such smokes offer a perfect screen against enemy vision, whether it is the man who sights the machine gun, the observer in the lookout station, the cannoneer, or even the aeroplane observer. Every shot through impenetrable smoke is a shot in the dark and has a 1/10 or even less chance of hitting its mark. Smoke affords a means of decreasing the accuracy of firing, much the same as night decreases it, without the inherent difficulties of night action. Peace strategy. The strategy of successful war involves the strategy of peace. This has been true from the days when David with his slingshot slew Goliath, down to the present moment. We don't always think of it in connection with war, but back of every successful war has been preparation during peace. It may have been incidental preparation such as the training of men in fighting Indians, and in creating public sentiment favorable to an independent nation that preceded the Revolutionary War. It may, on the other hand, have been a deeply studied policy such as that of the Germans prior to the World War. They tried and generally quite successfully, to coordinate all peace activities toward the day when a war should come that would decide the future destiny of the German Empire. And it was only because of that study in peace that Germany almost single-handed was able to stand out for more than 4 years against the world. The Allies came near losing that war because they did not appreciate that the strategy of efficient war had to be preceded by the strategy of peace. Chemical warfare an example. Chemical warfare is a particularly good example of this fact. Prior to the World War we had acknowledged, and without any misgivings, that Germany led the world in chemistry, that it produced most of the dyes in the world, and to a large extent the medicines of the world. We felt that when American needs showed it to be advisable we could take up chemistry and chemical production and soon excel the Germans. We had not reckoned on the suddenness of war. We were just getting ready with chemicals, and that included powders and high explosives, when the war closed. And yet we had had not only 18 months intensive preparation after our own entry into the World War, but also the preparation of great steel institutions and powder factories for nearly 3 years in manufacturing supplies for the Allies who preceded us in the war. Coal tar. The World War opened the eyes of England, France and Japan as well as the United States. Each of them today is struggling to build up a great chemical industry as the very foundation of successful war. Few of us realized prior to the World War that in the black, sticky mess called coal tar from the coking of coal or the manufacture of gas from coal and oil, was stored up most of the high explosives used in war, the majority of the poison gases. A great deal of the medicines of the world, and nearly all the dyes of the world. The Germans realized it and in their control over methods of using this material, together with the great commercial plants developed to manufacture it, as well as with the trained personnel that must go with such plants, were enabled. When blockaded on land and sea, to furnish the munitions, the clothing and the food needed for 4½ years of war. Great chemical industries. Thus it is that our government today is giving most serious heed to the need of building up a great chemical industry in the United States. We have the raw materials. We need only the factories and the trained men that go with them. We need, of course, in addition to the development of the coal tar industry, a production of heavy chemicals such as chlorine, sulfuric acid and the like, all of which, however, are bound together by community interest in peace as well as in war. Reserves of chemists. A part of the strategy of peace is the card indexing of the manpower of a nation divided into special groups. In one great group must come those who have a knowledge of chemistry and the chemical industries. That must be so worked out that if war should come on a moment's notice, within 24 hours thereafter every chemist could be given his jobs extending from the firing line to the research laboratory. And that is the task of the Chemical Warfare Service. And right here it is well to know that Congress, among the other features of its Army Reorganization Act of June 4, 1920, provided for a separate Chemical Warfare Service with these powers. Chemical Warfare Powers. The Chief of the Chemical Warfare Service under the authority of the Secretary of War shall be charged with the investigation, development, manufacture, or procurement and supply to the Army of all smoke and incendiary materials, all toxic gases, and all gas defense appliances. The research, design, and experimentation connected with chemical warfare and its material, and chemical projectile filling plants and proving grounds. The supervision of the training of the Army in chemical warfare, both offensive and defensive, including the necessary schools of instruction. The organization, equipment, training, and operation of special gas troops, and such other duties as the President may from time to time prescribe. Why power is needed? These rather broad powers indicate that Congress realized the unity of effort that must be made from the research laboratory to the firing line if America was to keep pace with Germany or any other nation in chemical warfare. Some have raised the question as to whether a service should be both supply and combat. Perhaps the best answer to that question is that so organized chemical warfare was a success in the World War. It was a success notwithstanding it had to be developed in the field 6 months after our entry into the war and with no precedents, no materials, no literature, and no personnel. Through its officers on the staffs of commanding generals of armies, corps and divisions, and through its fighting gas troops in the front line, it was enabled to direct its research, development and manufacture more quickly along lines shown to be necessary by every change in battle conditions, than any other service. Chemical warfare troops. And why should there not be fighting chemical warfare troops? They fight under exactly the same orders as all other troops. They conform to the same general plan of battle. They bring, however, to that battle experts in a line that it takes a long time to master. And where has there been any live commander in the world's history who refused aid from any class of troops that might help him win? Specialists in war. The wars of the future will become more and more wars of the specialists. Your infantry may remain the backbone of the fighting force, but if it has not the artillery, the aviation, the chemical warfare, the engineers, the tanks and other specialists to back it up, it will be overcome by the army which has such specialists. Indeed, the specialist goes into the very organization of the infantry itself with its machine gun battalions, its tank battalions, and as now proposed, the infantry light howitzer companies. Duties of Chemical Warfare Staff Officers. The chemical warfare officers on the staff of armies, corps and divisions are there for the purpose of giving expert advice as to the quantities of chemical materials available, the best conditions for using them, and the best way of avoiding the effects of enemy gas upon our own troops. The conditions that must be kept in mind are so many that no other officer can be expected to master and keep them if he does his own work well. The general staff officers and commanding generals will not have the time to even try to remember the actual effects of clouds, wind, rain, trees, valleys, villages and plains upon each and every gas. They must depend upon the chemical warfare officer for accurate information along those lines, and if he cannot furnish it they will have to secure someone who can. The history of war is filled with the names of generals who failed because they could not forget how to command a company. These chemical warfare officers will also furnish all data as to supply of chemical warfare materials, and will furnish the best information along lines of training, whether for defensive or offensive use of gas. Gas used by all arms. As before stated, we cannot confine the use of gas to any one arm. We may then ask why, if it is applicable to all arms, it should need special gas troops. Special gas troops are for the purpose of putting off great quantities of chemical warfare materials by special methods that are not applicable to any other branch now organized or that any other branch has the time to master. Long-range firing of gas by the artillery can be done just as well by the artillery as by gas troops. Why? Because in the mechanics of firing chemical ammunition there is no difference whatever from the mechanics of firing high explosives or shrapnel. The same will be true of gas rifle grenades and smoke candles in use by the infantry. The same will be true of the dropping of gas bombs and the sprinkling of gas by the aeroplanes. In this connection just remember that all of the army is trained in first aid, but in addition we have our ambulance companies, our hospitals, and our trained medical personnel. Arguments against use of gas. It has been many times suggested since the armistice that the use of poisonous gas in war may be done away with by agreement among nations. The arguments against the use of gas are that it is inhumane and that it might be used against non-combatants, especially women and children. The inhumanity of it is absolutely disproven by the results of its use in the World War. The death rate from gas alone was less than 1/12 that from bullets, high explosives and other methods of warfare. The disability rate for gas patients discharged was only about 1/4 that for the wounded discharged for other causes. The permanently injured is likewise apparently very much less than from other causes. Humanity. No reliable statistics that we can get show that gas in any way causes tuberculosis any more than a severe attack of bronchitis or pneumonia causes tuberculosis. Since its principal effects are upon the lungs and, therefore, hidden from sight, every impostor is beginning to claim gassing as the reason for his wanting war risk benefits from the government. We do not claim there may not be some who are suffering permanent injuries from gas, and we are trying very hard to find out from the manufacturers of poisonous gases and allied chemicals if they have any authentic records of such cases. So far the results indicate that permanent after-effects are very rare. As to non-combatants, certainly we do not contemplate using poisonous gas against them, no more at least than we propose to use high explosives in long-range guns or aeroplanes against them. The use of the one against non-combatants is just as damnable as the other and it is just as easy to refrain from using one as the other. Gas cannot be abolished. As to the abandonment of poison gas, it must be remembered that no powerful weapon of war has ever been abandoned once it proved its power unless a more powerful weapon was discovered. Poisonous gas in the World War proved to be one of the most powerful of all weapons of war. For that reason alone it will never be abandoned. It cannot be stopped by agreement, because if you can stop the use of any one powerful weapon of war by agreement you can stop all war by agreement. To prepare to use it only in case it is used against you is on the same plane as an order that was once upon a time issued to troops in the Philippine Islands. That order stated in substance that no officer or soldier should shoot a savage Moro, even were he approaching the said officer or soldier with drawn kris, sword, unless actually first struck by such savage. Every officer preferred, if necessary, to face a court-martial for disobedience of such an order rather than allow a savage Moro with a drawn kris to get anywhere near, let alone wait until actually struck. Let the world know that we propose to use gas against all troops that may be engaged against us, and that we propose to use it to the fullest extent of our ability. We believe that such a proposition will do more to head off war than all the peace propaganda since time began. It has been said that we should not use gas against those not equipped with gas. Then why did we use repeating rifles and machine guns against Negritos and Moros armed only with bows and arrows or poor muskets and knives? Let us apply the same common sense to the use of gas that we apply to all other weapons of war. Effect on World War Tactics. A very brief study of the effects of chemical warfare materials on the strategy of the World War will indicate its future. It began with clouds of chlorine let loose from heavy cylinders buried under the firing trench. These took a long time to install and then a wait, sometimes long, sometimes brief, for a favorable wind, but even at that these cloud gas attacks created a new method of fighting and forced new methods of protection. Gas at once added a tremendous burden to supply in the field, to manufacture, and to transportation, and in a short time even made some decided changes in the tactics of the battlefield itself. Cloud gas. The fact that the gas cloud looked like smoke is responsible for the name, cloud gas. Really all gases are nearly or wholly invisible, but those which volatilize suddenly from the liquid state so cool the air as to cause clouds of condensed water vapor. The cloud obscured everything behind and in front of it. It led the German to put off fake smoke clouds and attack through them, thus taking the British at a tremendous disadvantage. Then and there began a realization of the value of smoke. Cloud gas was also the real cause of the highly organized raid that became common in every army during the World War. The real purpose in the first raids, carried out by means of the box barrage, was to find out whether or not gas cylinders were being installed in trenches. These raids finally became responsible, in a large measure, for driving the old cloud gas off the field of battle. It did not, however, stop the British from putting off cloud gas attacks in 1918 by installing their gas cylinders on their light railway cars and then letting the gas loose from the cylinders while still on the cars. This enabled them to move their materials to the front and put off gas attacks on a few hours' notice when the wind was right. Toxic smoke candles. Today we have poisonous smokes that exist in solid form and that are perfectly safe to handle until a fuse is lighted. The so-called candles will be light enough so that one man can carry them. With these, cloud gas can be put off on an hour's notice when wind and weather conditions are right, no matter how fast the army may be moving and whether on the advance or in retreat. Cloud gas will usually be put off at night because the cloud cannot be seen, because then men are tired and sleepy, and all but the most highly trained become panicky. Under those conditions the greatest casualties result. The steadiness of wind currents also aids cloud gas attacks at night. Value of training in peace. And this brings up the value of training in peace. We are frequently asked, why do you need training with masks in peace? Why do you need training with actual gas in peace? Cannot these things be taught on short notice in war? The answer is, no. Nothing will take the place of training in peace. All of us recall that early in the war the Germans spread broadcast charges that the Allies were using unfair and inhumane methods of fighting because they brought the Gurkha with his terrible knife from Asia and the Moroccan from Africa. And we all know that after a time the Germans ceased saying anything about these troops. What was the cause? They were not efficient. Just as the Negro will follow a white officer over the top in daylight and fight with as much energy and courage and many times as much efficiency as the white man, he cannot stand the terrors of the night. And the same was true of the Gurkha and the Moroccan. All the Allies soon recognized that fact as shown by their drawing those troops almost entirely away from the fighting lines. In some cases dark-skinned troops were kept only as shock troops to be replaced by the more highly developed Caucasian when the line had to be held for days under the deadly fire of the counterattack. The German idea, and our own idea prior to the World War, was that semi-savages could stand the rigors and terrors of war better than the highly sensitive white man. War proved that to be utterly false. Familiarity with gas necessary. The same training that makes for advancement in science, and success in manufacture and peace, gives the control of the body that holds the white man to the firing line no matter what its terrors. A great deal of this comes because the white man has had trained out of him nearly all superstition. He has had drilled into him for hundreds of years that powder and high explosive can do certain things and no more. If the soldier is not to be afraid of gas, we must give him an equal knowledge of it, its dangers, and its limitations. The old adage says, familiarity breeds contempt. Perhaps that is not quite true, but we all know that it breeds callousness and forgetfulness, that the man manufacturing dynamite or other more dangerous explosives takes chances that we who do not engage in such manufacture shudder at. Edgewood chemists not afraid. All of this has direct application to training with chemical warfare materials in peace. We believe that all opposition to chemical warfare today can be divided into two classes, those who do not understand it and those who are afraid of it, ignorance and cowardice. Our chemists at Edgewood Arsenal are every day toying with the most powerful chemical compounds, toying with mixtures they know nothing of, not knowing what instant they may induce an explosion of some fearful poisonous gas. But they have learned how to protect themselves. They have learned that if they stop breathing and get out of that place and on the windward side they are safe. They have been at that work long enough to do that automatically. Staff officers must think of gas in every problem. The staff officer must train the army man in peace with all chemical warfare materials or he will lose his head in war and become a casualty. The general staff officers and commanding generals must so familiarize themselves with these gases and their general use that they will think them in all their problems just exactly as they think of the infantry, or of the cavalry, or of the tanks or of the artillery in every problem. On them rests the responsibility that these gases are used properly in battle. If plans before the battle do not include these materials for every arm and in the proper quantities of the proper kinds, they will not be used properly on the field of battle, and on them will rest the responsibility. They are not expected to know all the details of gases and their uses. But they will be expected to consider the use of gas in every phase of preparing plans and orders, and then to appeal to the chemical warfare officers for the details that will enable them to use the proper gases and the proper quantities. They cannot go into those details any more than they can go into the details of each company of infantry. If they try to do that, they are a failure as staff officers. Effect of masks on troops. The very best of masks cause a little decrease in vision, a little increase in breathing resistance, and a little added discomfort in warm weather, and hence the soldier must learn to use them under all conditions. But above all in the future he must be so accustomed to the use of the mask that he will put it on automatically, almost in his sleep as it were. We have tear gases, today, so powerful and so sudden in their action that it is doubtful if 1 man out of 5 who has had only a little training can get his mask on if subject to the tear gas alone, that is, with tear gas striking him with full force before he is aware of it. Effectiveness of gas in World War. In the past war more than 27 out of every 100 Americans killed and wounded suffered from gas alone. You may say that many of the wounds were light. That is true. But those men were put out of the battle line for from 1 to 4 months, divisions, corps and armies almost broken up, and yet the use of gas in that war was a child's game compared to what it will be in the future. It is even said that many of them were malingerers. Perhaps they were, but do you not suppose that there were at least as many malingerers among the enemy as there were in our own ranks? Furthermore, if you can induce malingering, it is a proper method of waging war, and unless our boasted ability is all a myth, we should have fewer malingerers under conditions of battle than any other nation. Strategy of gas at Picardy Plains. Let us go back now to the strategy of gas in war. Following the cloud gas came tear gases and poisonous gases in shells and bombs. A little advance in tactics here and a little there, the idea, though, in the early days being only to produce casualties. As usual, the Germans awoke first to the fact that gas might be used strategically and on a large scale. And thus we find that 10 days before he began the Battle of Picardy Plains he deluged many sections of the front with mustard gas. He secured casualties by the thousands, but he secured something of greater importance. He wore out the physical vigor and lowered the morale of division after division, thus paving the way for the break in the British army which almost led him through to the sea. He used non-persistent gases up to the very moment when his own men reached the British lines, thereby reducing the efficiency of British rifle and artillery fire and saving his own men. And this is just a guide to the future. A recent writer in the Field Artillery Journal states that gas will probably not be used in the barrage because of its probable interference with the movement of our own troops. In making that statement he forgot the enemy, and you cannot do that if you expect to win a war. Gas in barrages. In the future we must expect the enemy to be in a measure as well prepared in chemical warfare as we are. Let us consider the special case of our own men advancing to the attack behind a rolling barrage. We will consider also that the wind is blowing toward our own troops. Obviously under those conditions the wind will blow our own gas back onto our troops. Will we use gas in that barrage? We certainly will. Because with the wind blowing toward our own troops we have the exact ideal condition that the enemy wants for his use of gas. He will then be deluging our advancing troops with all the gas he can fire, in addition to high explosives and shrapnel. Our men must wear masks and take every precaution against enemy gas. How foolish it would be not to fire gas at the enemy under those conditions. If we did not fire gas we would leave him entirely free from wearing masks, and entirely free from taking every other precaution against gas while our own troops were subject to all the difficulties of gas. No, we will fire gas at him in just as great quantities as we consider efficient. And that is just a sample of what is coming on every field of battle, gas used on both sides by every method of putting it over that can be devised. World War Lessons Only Guideposts. Example of bookworms. Every lesson taught by the World War must be taken as a guidepost on the road to future success in war. No use of gas or other materials in the past war must be taken as an exact pattern for use in any battle of the future. Too much study, too much attention to the past, may cause that very thing to happen. A certain general commanding a brigade in the Argonne told me just recently that while the battle was going on a general staff officer called him on the telephone and asked him what the situation was. He gave it to him. The staff officer then asked, "What are you doing?" and he told him. The staff officer replied, "Why, the book doesn't say to do it that way under such conditions." There you have the absurd side of too much study and too close reliance on details of the past. The battlefield is a perfect kaleidoscope. The best we can hope to get out of books is a guide, something that we will keep in our minds to help us decide the best way to meet certain situations. He who tries to remember a particular position taught in his school with the idea of applying that to actual use in battle is laying the foundation for absolute failure. Your expert rifleman never thinks back when he goes to fire a shot as to just what his instructor told him or what the book said. He just concentrates his mind on the object to be attained, using so far as comes to him facts he has learned from books or teachers. Your general and your staff must do the same. Infantry use of gas. A few words about how we will use gas in the future. We will start with the infantry. The infantry as such will use gas in only 2 or 3 ways. They will use some gas in rifle grenades, and a great deal more smoke. We speak of the rifle grenade because in our opinion the hand grenade is a thing of the past. We do not believe there will ever be used in the future any grenade that is not applicable to the rifle. The infantry will probably often carry large quantities of gas in the shape of the toxic smoke candle. These materials being solids may be shot up by rifles or artillery fire, run over by trucks or tractors, or trampled and still be harmless. It is only when the fuses are lighted and the material driven off by heat that they are dangerous. In using these candles under these conditions you must have sufficient chemical warfare officers and soldiers to get the necessary control indicated by the sun, wind, woods, fogs, ravines and the like. Cavalry use of gas. Next consider the cavalry. The cavalry will use gas practically the same as the infantry. The chemical warfare troops will accompany the cavalry with Stokes mortars or other materials to fire gases into small enemy strongholds that may be encountered, whether machine gun nests, mountain tops, woods or villages. They will do this either against savages or civilized people. Methods of making these materials mobile for that purpose are already well underway. If against savages and one does not want to kill them, use tear gases. No better method of searching out hidden snipers in mountain tops, among rocks or villages, in ravines, or in forests was ever invented. Use of gas by tanks. The tanks will employ gas in the same way as the infantry, with the possibility, however, that they may be used to carry large quantities of gas on caterpillar tractors where otherwise it would be difficult to move the gas. This is not a certainty, but is a situation promising enough to warrant further study. Artillery use of gas. Your artillery will fire gas and smoke in every caliber of gun. There is a tendency now to limit gas to certain guns and howitzers and to limit smoke to even a smaller number of guns. This is a mistake that we are going to recognize. A very careful study of the records of the war show that more casualties were produced several times over by 1,000 gas shells than by 1,000 high explosive or shrapnel. And that is because gas has an inherent permanence that no other weapon of war has. Permanency of gas. The bullet whistles through the air and does its work or misses. The high explosive shell bursts, hurling its fragments that in a few seconds settle to earth, and its work is done. The shrapnel acts in the same way, but when one turns loose a shell of gas it will kill and injure the same as the high explosive shell and in the same length of time and in addition for some minutes thereafter. Even with the non-persistent gases, it will continue on its way, causing death or injury to every unprotected animal, man or beast in its path. With the persistent gases, the materials from each shell may persist for days. Variety of uses of gas. This brings up the point of the great variety of uses to which gas can be put. The non-persistent gas may be used at all times where one wants to get rid of it in a few moments, the persistent gas wherever one wants to keep the enemy under gas for days at a time. We will use mustard gas on strong points in the advance, on flanks, on distant areas one will not expect to be reached. And as our own protection of masks and clothing increases toward perfection, we will use it on the very fields you expect to cross. Why? Because we will be firing it at the enemy for days beforehand and we will cause him trouble all those days while we ourselves will encounter it for a few hours at the most. So do not think that mustard gas is only going to be used in defense in the future. Solid mustard gas and long-range guns. We will come to use chemical warfare materials just as high explosives and bullets are used today, even though at times we do suffer an occasional loss from our own weapons. Our artillery and long-range guns where we want destruction will fill each shell with say 15% gas and 85% high explosive. We have a solid mustard gas that may be so used. We have tremendously powerful tear gases and irritating gases that may be so used. Being solids, they do not affect the ballistic qualities of the shell. And what an added danger will mustard gas from every shell bring against railroad centers, rest villages, cantonments, crossroads and the like. The results will be too great for any force to overlook such use. Tear gases in shrapnel. We will probably use tear gas in most, if not all, of our shrapnel. The general idea now is that we should not put tear gas in all shrapnel because under certain conditions it will be blown back and harass our own troops. But as was said before, we must remember that the enemy will be using gas at all times as well as ourselves, and hence if we limit ourselves in any line we give the enemy an advantage. This use of gas by the artillery will extend to all classes of guns, seacoast, field, turret and what not. Use of gas by air service. Bombs. Let us next consider the air service. We naturally think of dropping gas in bombs when we speak of the use of gas by the air service. Gas will so be used, and it will be used in bombs of perhaps 1,000 pounds or even a ton in weight, at least 50% of which will be gas. Such gases, however, will be of the non-persistent type, phosgene or similar ones. They will be used against concentration camps and crossroads, on troops on the road in columns, against railroad centers and rest areas. In other words, against groups of men or animals. Sprinkling. But that is not even the beginning of the use of gas by aeroplanes. Mustard gas, which is 1/3 again as heavy as water, and which volatilizes far slower than water, may be sprinkled through a small opening such as a bung hole in a tank that simply lets liquid float out. The speed of the aeroplane will atomize it. In this way, gas can be sprinkled over whole areas that must be crossed in battle. The Lewisite, of which we have heard considerable, will be used. It is less persistent than the mustard gas, but like mustard gas it produces casualties by burning. Unlike mustard gas, however, the burns from a quantity equal to 3 drops will usually cause death. The material can be made up by hundreds, even thousands, of tons per month. We are working on clothing that will keep it out just as we have been and are working on clothing that will protect against mustard gas. But these gases are so powerful that if any opening be left in the clothing the gas will get through, so that even if we get clothing that will protect, it must cover every inch of the skin from head to foot. Besides, the mask must be worn at all times. Consider the burden put on any army in the field that would have to continually wear such complete protection. What a strain on the mentality of the men. As before said, to endure it at all we must train our men to think of such conditions, to face them in peace, and in order to do so we must actually use gas. Just as in the World War the highly trained Caucasian outdistanced the savage in endurance, just so will the most highly trained men in the future outdistance all others in endurance. Navy. We now come to the consideration of the Navy. The Navy will use gas both in its guns and in smoke clouds, and in some form of candle that will float. The toxic smokes that in high enough concentrations will kill are extraordinarily irritating in minute quantities, so minute they cannot be seen or felt for a few moments. Every human being on a ship must breathe every minute just as every human being everywhere must breathe every minute or die. A gas that gets into the ventilating system of a ship will go all through it and the Navy realizes it. The Navy is studying how to keep the gas out of their own ships, and how to get it into the enemy's ships. The toxic smokes may be dropped from aeroplanes or turned loose from underwater by submarines. In either case they will give off smokes over wide areas through which ships must pass. Any defects will let these toxic smokes in and will force every man to wear a mask. Aeroplane bombs will come raining down on the ship or alongside of it either with toxic smokes or other terrible gases. White phosphorus that burns and cannot be put out wet or dry will be rained on ships. Yes, chemical warfare materials will be used by the Navy. Gas against landing parties. The use of gas against landing parties or to aid landing parties has come up in many ways. Our studies to date indicate that gas is a greater advantage to the defense against landing parties than to the offense. Mustard gas and the like may be sprinkled from aeroplanes, and while it will not float long on the water, it will float long enough to smear any small boats attempting to land. It can be sprinkled over all the areas that landing parties must occupy. Mustard gas may be placed in bombs or drums around all areas that are apt to be used as landing places and exploded in the face of advancing troops. Storing reserve gases in peace. And a word here about how long gases may be stored. One of the statements made by opponents of chemical warfare was that gas is a purely wartime project and could not be stored up in peace. We have today at Edgewood Arsenal some 1,400 tons of poisonous gases not including chlorine. Those gases have been manufactured, practically every ounce of them, for 3 years, and are yet in almost perfect condition. Our chemists believe they can be kept in the future for 10 years and perhaps longer. Our gas shells then will have the life almost of a modern battleship, while the cost of $1 million will be but a fraction of the cost of a battleship. What I have just said applies particularly to liquid gases such as phosgene, chlorpicrin, and mustard gas. We know that many of the solids may be kept for far longer periods. Storing gas masks. Our masks, too, we believe can be kept for at least 10 years. Experience to date indicates that rubber deteriorates mainly through the action of sunlight and moisture that cause oxidation or other change in the crystalline structure of cured rubber. Accordingly, we are putting up masks today in hermetically sealed boxes. It is thus evident that we can store a reserve of masks and gases in peace the same as other war materials. Use of gas by gas troops. Now we come to the use of gas by special gas troops. In the war, gas troops used 4-inch Stokes mortars and 8-inch Livens projectors and in a very short time would have used a new portable cylinder for setting off cloud gas, using liquid gases, such as phosgene. They will use these same weapons in future wars. All of these are short-range weapons, but since the Livens bomb or drum contains 50% of its weight in gas while the artillery shell contains 10%. They have an efficiency away beyond that of artillery or any other method of discharging gas except cloud gas. They will, therefore, produce more casualties than any other method known for the amount of material taken to the front. These short-range weapons were developed by the British for trench use and not for open warfare, and yet our troops developed methods with the Stokes mortars that enabled them to keep up with many of the infantry divisions. Phosphorus and thermit against machine gun nests. The use of phosphorus and thermit against German machine gun nests by the gas troops is well known. How effective it was is not known to so many. Phosphorus and thermit were so used from the early days of the Marne fight in the latter part of July, 1918, to the very close of the war. There is no recorded instance where the gas troops failed to silence machine gun nests once the machine guns were located. In the future, gas troops will put off the majority of all cloud gas attacks even with toxic smoke candles. Necessity for training in peace. This is an outline of the subject of chemical warfare. As stated in the beginning, the fundamental underlying principles for the successful use of poisonous gas is necessarily the same as for any other war materials. The necessity for continuous training in peace is just the same with chemical warfare as with the rifle, the machine gun, with field artillery or any other weapon of war. Indeed, it is more so because the use of gas is so perfectly adaptable to night work. Men must be taught to take precautionary measures when so sleepy, tired, and worn out that they will sleep through the roar of artillery. How chemical warfare should be considered. We ask you only to look at the use of chemical warfare materials as you look at the use of the artillery, infantry, cavalry, tanks or aeroplanes. Measure its possible future use. Not simply by its use in the World War, but by considering all possible developments of the future. Remember that its use was barely 4 years old when the war closed, while the machine gun, the latest type of infantry weapon, had been known for more than 1/3 of a century. Chemical warfare developments are in the infant stage. Even those on the inside of chemical warfare when the armistice was signed can see today things that are certain to come that were undreamed of at that time. This is bound to be so with a new weapon. To sum up, gas is a universal weapon, applicable to every arm and every sort of action. Since we can choose gases that are either liquid or solid, that are irritating only or highly poisonous, that are visible or invisible, that persist for days or that pass with the wind. We have a weapon applicable to every act of war and for that matter, to every act of peace. But we must plan its use, remembering there is no middle ground in war, it is success or failure, life or death. Remember also that training outruns production in a great war, that 5 million men can be raised and trained before they can be equipped unless we with proper foresight build up our essential industries, keep up our reserve of supplies. And above all, keep such perfect plans that we can turn all the wheels of peace into the wings of war on a moment's notice. Chapter 23. The offensive use of gas. What chemical warfare includes. Chemical warfare includes all gas, smoke and incendiary materials and all defensive appliances, of which the mask is the principal item, used by the army. Some of the items or materials in both offense and defense are used by the entire army, while a few are used only by chemical warfare troops. The term gas. The term gas is now taken to include all materials that are carried to the enemy by the air, after their liberation from cylinders, bombs or shell. It is necessary that this broad use of the term gas be thoroughly understood, because some of these materials are solids, while all others are liquids, until liberated from the containers at the time of the attack. These containers may be special cylinders for cloud gas attacks, special bombs for Livens projectors and mortars, or artillery shell, and even aviation bombs. Some of the liquids which have a very low boiling point volatilize quickly upon exposure to air, and hence require only enough explosive to open the shell and allow the liquid to escape. Practically all solids have to be pulverized by a large amount of high explosive, or driven off as smoke by some heating mixture. Technical nature. Chemical warfare, besides being the newest, is the most technical and most highly specialized service under the War Department. There is no class of people in civil life, and no officers or men in the War Department, who can take up chemical warfare successfully until they have received training in its use. This applies not only to the use of materials in attack, but to the use of materials for defense. 10 years from now perhaps this will not be true. It is certainly hoped that it will not be. By that time the entire army should be pretty thoroughly trained in the general principles and many of the special features of chemical warfare. If not, chemical warfare cannot be used in the field with the efficiency and success with which it deserves to be used. Furthermore, it is believed that within 10 years the knowledge of the gases used in chemical warfare will be so common through the development of the use of these same materials in civil life, that it will not be so difficult, as at the present date, to get civilians who are acquainted with chemical warfare service materials. Effectiveness of gas. Chemical warfare materials were used during the war by chemical warfare service troops, by the artillery and by the infantry. In the future the air service and navy will be added to the above list. Chemical warfare, even under the inelastic methods of the Germans, proved one of the most powerful means of offense with which the American troops had to contend. To realize its effectiveness we need only remember that more than 27 out of every 100 casualties on the field of battle were from gas alone. Unquestionably many of those who died on the battlefield from other causes suffered also from gas. No other single element of war, unless you call powder a basic element, accounted for so many casualties among the American troops. Indeed, it is believed that a greater number of casualties was not inflicted by any other arm of the service, unless possibly the infantry, and even in that case it would be necessary to account for all injured by bullets, the bayonet, machine guns and hand grenades. This is true, in spite of the fact that the German was so nearly completely out of gas when the Americans began their offensive at Saint-Mihiel and the Argonne, that practically no gas casualties occurred during the St. Mihiel offensive, and only a very few until after a week of the Argonne fighting. Furthermore, the Germans knew that an extensive use of mustard gas against the American lines on the day the attack was made, and also on the line that marked the end of the first advance a few days later, would have produced tremendous casualties. Judging from the results achieved at other times by an extensive use of mustard gas, it is believed that had the German possessed this gas and used it as he had used it a few other times, American casualties in the Argonne would have been doubled. In fact, the advance might even have been entirely stopped, thus prolonging the war into the year 1919. Humanity of gas. A few words right here about the humanity of gas are not out of place. Notwithstanding the army and the general public have now so completely endorsed chemical warfare that it is believed the argument of inhumanity has no weight whatever. There were 3 great reasons why chemical warfare was first widely advertised throughout the world as inhumane and horrible. These reasons may be summed up as follows. In the first place, the original gas used at Ypres in 1915 was chlorine. And chlorine is one of a group of gases known as suffocants, gases that cause death generally by suffocating the patient through spasms of the epiglottis and throat. That is the most agonizing effect produced by any gas. The second reason was unpreparedness. The English had no masks, no gas-proof dugouts, nor any of the other paraphernalia that was later employed to protect against poisonous gas. Consequently, the death rate in the first gas attack at Ypres was very high, probably 35%. As a matter of fact, every man who was close to the front line died. The only ones who escaped were those on the edges of the cloud of gas or so far to the rear that the concentration had decreased below the deadly point. The third great reason was simply propaganda. It was good war propaganda to impress upon everybody the fact that the German was capable of using any means that he could develop in order to win a victory. He had no respect for previous agreements or ideas concerning warfare. This propaganda kept up the morale and fighting spirit of the Allies, and was thoroughly justifiable upon that score, even when it led to wild exaggeration. The chlorine used in the first attack by the German is the least poisonous of the gases now used. Those later introduced, such as phosgene, mustard gas and diphenylchloroarsine, are from 5 to 10 times as effective. The measure of humanity for any form of warfare is the percentage of deaths to the total number injured by the particular method of warfare under consideration. American gas casualties. The official list of casualties in battle as compiled by the Surgeon General's Office covering all cases reported up to September 1, 1919, is 258,338. Of these 70,752, or 27.4%, were gas casualties. Also of the above casualties 46,519 resulted in death, of whom about 1,400 only were due to gas. From these figures it is readily deduced that while 85% of all casualties from bullets and high explosives resulted in death, only 2% of those wounded by gas resulted in death. That is, a man wounded on the battlefield with gas had 12 times as many chances of recovery as the man who was wounded with bullets and high explosives. Fundamentals of chemical warfare. Before taking up in some detail the methods of projecting gas upon the enemy, it is very desirable to understand the fundamentals of chemical warfare, in so far as they pertain to poisonous gases. Following the first use of pure chlorine, all the principal nations engaged in the war began investigations into a wide range of substances in the hope of finding others more poisonous, more easily produced, and more readily projected upon the enemy. These investigations led to the use of a large number of gases which seriously complicated manufacture, supply, and the actual use of the gases in the field. Gradually a more rational conception of chemical warfare led both the Allies and the enemy to restrict the numbers of gases to a comparative few, and still later to divide all gases into 3 groups. Thus the German divided his into 3 groups known as 1. Green cross, the highly poisonous non-persistent gases, 2. Blue cross, or diphenylchloroarsine, popularly known as sneezing gas, and 3. Yellow cross, highly persistent gases, such as mustard gas. In the American Chemical Warfare Service we have finally divided all gases into 2 primary groups. These groups are known as non-persistent and persistent. The non-persistent gases are those quickly volatilizing upon exposure to the air, and hence those that are carried away at once by air currents, or that in a dead calm will be completely dissipated into the surrounding air in a few hours. If sufficient high explosive be used to pulverize solids, they may be used in the same way, and to a large extent certain highly persistent liquid gases may have their persistency greatly reduced by using a large amount of high explosive, which divides the liquid into a fine spray. The persistent group constitutes those gases that are very slowly volatilized upon exposure to the atmosphere. The principal ones of these now used or proposed are mustard gas and bromobenzylcyanide. For purposes of economy, and hence efficiency, certain gases, both persistent and non-persistent, are placed in a 3rd group known as the irritant group. These gases are effective in extremely low concentrations against the lungs and other air passages, or the eyes. Diphenylchloroarsine, and some other solids when divided into minute particles by high explosive or heat, irritate the nose, throat and lungs to such an extent in a concentration of 1 part in 10 millions of air as to be unbearable in a few minutes. The tear gases are equally powerful in their effects on the eyes. The irritating gases are used to force the wearing of the mask, which in turn reduces the physical vigor and efficiency of the troops. This reduction in efficiency, even with the best masks, is probably 25% for short periods, and much more if prolonged wearing of the mask is forced. Efficiency of irritant gases. 1 pound of the irritant gases is equal to 500 to 1,000 pounds of other gases when forcing the wearing of the mask alone is desired. The great economy resulting from their use is thus apparent. Due to the rapid evaporation of the non-persistent gases, they are used generally only in dense clouds, whether those clouds be produced from cylinders or from bombs. These gases are used only for producing immediate casualties, as the necessary amount of gas to force the enemy to constantly wear his mask by the use of non-persistent gases alone could not possibly be taken to the front. Mustard gas, which is highly persistent and also attacks the lungs, eyes, and skin of the body, may and will be used to force the wearing of the mask. It has one disadvantage when it is desired to force immediately the wearing of the mask, and that is its delayed action and the fact that it acts so slowly, and is usually encountered in such slight concentrations that several hours' exposure are necessary to produce a severe casualty. For these reasons the enemy may often take chances in the heat of battle with mustard gas, and while himself becoming a casualty, inflict quite heavy casualties upon opposing troops by continuing to operate his guns or rifles without masks. A powerful tear gas on the other hand forces the immediate wearing of the mask. Material of chemical warfare. Used by C.W.S. troops. Chemical warfare troops, in making gas attacks, use cylinders for the cloud or wave attack, and the Liven's projector and the 4-inch Stokes mortar for attacks with heavy concentrations of gas projected by bombs with ranges up to a mile. This distance will in the future probably be increased to 1.5 or 1.75 miles. The original cylinders used in wave attacks were heavy, cumbersome and very laborious to install, and notwithstanding the wave attack was known to be the deadliest form of gas attack used in the war, fell into disrepute after the use of gas became general in artillery shells and in special bombs. Cloud gas. The Americans at once concluded that since cloud gas attacks were so effective, efforts should be made to make these attacks of frequent occurrence by decreasing the weight of the cylinders, and by increasing the portability and methods of discharging the cylinders. As early as March, 1918, specifications for cylinders weighing not more than 65 pounds, filled and completely equipped for firing, were cabled to the United States. They would have been used in large numbers in the campaign of 1919 had the enemy not quit when he did. Toxic smoke candles that are filled with solids driven off by heat will probably be the actual method in the future for putting off cloud attacks. The toxic smoke candle is perfectly safe under all conditions and can be made in any size desired. Cloud gas attacks will be common in the future, and all plans of defense must be made accordingly. They will usually be made at night, when, due to fatigue and the natural sleepiness which comes at that time, men are careless, lose their way, or neglect their masks, and are thus caught unprepared. Experience in the war proved that a wave attack always produced casualties even, as several times occurred, when the enemy or the Allied troops knew some hours beforehand that the attack was coming. The English estimated these casualties to be 10 or 11% of the troops exposed. Liven's projectors. The second most effective weapon for using gas by gas troops was and will be the Liven's projector. This projector is nothing less than the simplest form of mortar, consisting of a straight-drawn steel tube and a steel base plate. As used during the World War by the Allies, it did not even have a firing pin or other mechanism in the base. The electric wires for firing passing out through the muzzle and alongside the drum or projectile, which was small enough to permit that method of firing. These were set by the hundreds, very close behind or even in front of the front line trenches. They were all fired at the same instant, or as nearly at the same instant as watches could be synchronized, and firing batteries operated. As discussed on 18, these mortars were placed deep enough in the ground to bring their muzzles practically level with the surface. It usually took several days to prepare the attack, and consequently allowed an opportunity for the enemy to detect the work by aeroplane photographs or by raids, and destroy the emplacements by artillery fire. It should be added, however, that notwithstanding this apparent great difficulty, very few attacks were broken up in that way. Nevertheless, in line with the general policy of the American troops to get away from anything that savored of trench warfare, and to make the fighting as nearly continuous as possible with every means available, the American Chemical Warfare Service set at work at once to develop an easy method of making projector attacks. It was early found that, if the excavation was made just deep enough so that the base plate could be set at the proper angle, the drums or projectiles were fired as accurately as when the projectors or mortars were set so that the muzzles were level with the surface. The time required to emplace a given number of mortars in this way was only about 1/5 of that required for digging them completely in. Coupled of course with these proposed improvements in methods, studies were being made and are still being made to produce lighter mortars, better powder charges, and better gas checks in order to develop the full force of the powder. Many improvements along this line can be made, all of which will result in greater mobility, more frequent attacks, and hence greater efficiency. 4-inch Stokes mortar. The Stokes mortar is not different from that used by the infantry, except that it is 4-inch, while the infantry Stokes is 3-inch. The 4-inch was chosen by the British for gas, as it was the largest caliber that could be fired rapidly and yet be moderately mobile. Its range of only about 1,100 yards handicapped it considerably. The poor design of the bomb was partly responsible for this. The powder charges also were neither well chosen nor well designed. It is believed that great improvements can be made in the shape of the bomb and in the powder charge, which will result in much longer range and high efficiency, while in no way increasing the weight of the bomb or decreasing the rate of fire. These last two weapons were used during the World War, and will be very extensively used in the future for firing high explosive, phosphorus, thermite and similar materials that non-technical troops might handle. Since gas has proven without the shadow of a doubt, that it will produce more casualties for an equal amount of material transported to the front than any other substance yet devised. All troops using short-range guns or mortars should be trained to fire gas whenever weather conditions are right. When weather conditions are not right, they should fire the other substances mentioned. The Livens projector with its 60-pound bomb, of which 30 pounds will be gas or high explosive, is a wonderful gun up to the limit of its range. The bomb, not being pointed, does not sink into the ground, and hence upon exploding exerts the full force of high explosive upon the surroundings, whether bombs, pillboxes, barbed wire or trenches, to say nothing of personnel. High explosive in projectors. When these are burst by the hundreds on a small area, everything movable is blotted out. Thus concrete machine gun emplacements, lookout stations, bomb-proofs and wire entanglements are destroyed, trenches filled up, and the personnel annihilated. This was amply demonstrated on the few occasions when it was actually used at the front. The American infantry, wherever they saw it tried out, were wild to have more of it used. The German was apparently equally anxious to have the use stopped. It is, however, one of the things that must be reckoned with in the future. It means practically that no man's land in the future will be just as wide as the extreme range of these crude mortars, and here a word of caution. While efforts have been made to increase the range of these mortars, whether of the Livens projector or Stokes variety, no further increase will be attempted when that increase reduces the speed of firing or the efficiency of the projectile. In other words, results depend upon large quantities of material delivered at the same instant on the point attacked, and if this cannot be obtained the method is useless. For this reason these mortars will never be a competitor of the artillery. The artillery will have all that it can do to cover the field within its range, beyond that reached by the mortars. Phosphorus in 4-inch Stokes. Phosphorus will be used largely by gas troops, but only in the 4-inch or other Stokes mortar that may be finally adopted as best. The Livens projector carries too great a quantity, and being essentially a single-shot gun, is not adapted to keeping up a smoke screen by slow and continued firing, or of being transported so as to keep up with the infantry. Phosphorus has also very great value for attacking personnel itself. Anyone who has been burned with phosphorus or has witnessed the ease with which it burns when exposed to air, wet or dry, has a most wholesome fear of it. The result of it in the war showed that the enemy machine gunners or other troops would not stand up under a bombardment of phosphorus fired from the 4-inch Stokes mortar, each bomb containing about 7 pounds. Thermit. Thermit is used in the same way, and while the idea of molten metal, falling upon men and burning through clothing and even helmets, is attractive in theory, it proved absolutely worthless for those purposes on the field of battle. It was found impossible to throw sufficiently large quantities of molten metal on a given spot to cause any considerable burn. In other words, the rapid spreading out and cooling of the metal almost entirely ruined its effectiveness, except its effect on the morale. This latter, however, was considerable, as one might judge from seeing the thermit shells burst in air. For this reason thermit may find a limited use in the future. The spread of gas. Height of gas cloud. The height to which gas rises in a gas cloud is not exactly known, but it is believed to be not much more than 50 feet, and then only at a considerable distance from the point of discharge. Moving pictures taken of gas clouds show this to be true. It is also indicated by the fact that pigeons, which are very susceptible to poisonous gas, practically always return to their cages safely when liberated in a gas cloud. This was a good deal of a mystery until it was realized that the pigeon escaped through his rising so quickly above the gas. This of course would be expected when it is known that practically all gases successfully used were 2 or more times as heavy as air. Such gases rise only by slow diffusion, or when carried upwards by rising currents. The absence of these upward currents at night is one of the reasons why gas attacks are more effective at night than during the day. Horizontal spread of gas. Another important thing to know in regard to the behavior of the wave of gas is the horizontal spread of a cloud. If gas be emitted from a cylinder, the total spread in both directions from that point is from 20 degrees to 30 degrees or an average of 25 degrees. This varies, of course, with the wind. The higher the wind the less the angle, though the variation due to wind is not as great as might be expected. This horizontal spread of the gas cloud was measured experimentally, and the results checked by aeroplane pictures of heavy wave attacks over the enemy line. In the latter case the path of the gas was very closely indicated by the dead vegetation. This vegetation was killed and bleached so that it readily showed up in aeroplane photographs. The visibility of a gas cloud arises from the fact that when a large amount of liquid is suddenly evaporated, the air is cooled and moisture condensed, thereby creating a fog. With gases such as mustard gas and others of slight volatility, a visible cloud is not formed. For purposes of identification of points struck by shell, smoke substances are occasionally added, or a few smoke shell fired with the gas shell. As future battlefields will be dotted everywhere with smoke clouds, a point that will be discussed more fully later, the firing of smoke with gas shell will probably be the rule and not the exception. Requirements of successful gas. If we succeed in getting a poisonous gas that has no odor, it will be highly desirable to fire it so that it will not be visible. In that case no smoke will be used. Carbon monoxide is such a gas, but there are several important reasons why it has not been used in war. These considerations indicate the general requirements for a successful poisonous gas. If non-persistent, it must be quickly volatilized, or must be capable of being driven off by heat or by other means, which can be readily and safely produced in the field. It must be highly poisonous, producing deaths in high concentrations, and more or less serious injuries when taken into the system in quantities as small as 1/10 of that necessary to produce death. If it has a slightly delayed action with no intervening discomfort, it is still better than one that produces immediate discomfort and more or less immediate action. It must be readily compressed into a liquid and remain so at ordinary temperatures, with the pressure not much above 25 or 30 pounds per square inch. As a persistent gas it must be effective in extremely low concentrations, in addition to having the other qualities mentioned above. These general characteristics concerning gases apply whether used by chemical warfare troops, the artillery, the air service, the navy, or the infantry. In speaking of these substances being used by the infantry, It is understood that an ample number of chemical warfare officers will be present to ensure that the gases may not be turned loose when weather conditions are such that the gas might drift back and become a menace to our own troops. This is absolutely essential since no troops who have as varied duties to perform as the infantry, can be sufficiently trained in the technical side of chemical warfare to know when to put it off on a large scale with safety and efficiency. Artillery use of gas. The artillery of the future will probably fire more gas than any other one branch of the army. There are two reasons for this: first, the large number of guns now accompanying every army, and second, the long range of many of these guns. As before indicated, the gases are adaptable to various uses, and hence to guns differing both in caliber and range. The gas will be fired by practically all guns, from the 75 mm, to the very largest in use. It is even possible that if guns smaller than the 75 mm, become generally useful that certain gases will be fired by them. Efficiency of artillery gas shell. It is well to remember in the beginning that all artillery shells so far designed and used, contain only about 10% gas, i.e., 10% of the total weight of shell and gas. It is hoped that gas shell may later be so designed that a somewhat greater proportion of the total weight of the shell will be gas than is now true. This is very desirable from the point of efficiency. As stated above, the bombs used by chemical warfare troops contain nearly 50% of their total weight in gas, and hence are nearly 5 times as efficient as artillery shell within the limit of range of these bombs. This fact alone is enough to warrant the use of gas troops to their full maximum capacity in order that the artillery may not fire gas at the ranges covered. Guns firing persistent and non-persistent gases. Considering the firing of non-persistent and persistent gases, it may be said generally that non-persistent gases will be fired only by the medium-caliber guns which are available in large numbers. In fact, the firing of non-persistent gases will be confined mainly to the 6-inch or 155 mm howitzer and gun. As our army was organized in France, and as it is organized at present, the number of 155 mm guns will be greater than all others put together, except the 75 mm. In order that a non-persistent gas may be most effective, a high concentration must be built up very quickly. This necessitates the use of the largest caliber shell that are available in large numbers. Of course, a certain percentage of the gas shell of other calibers may consist of non-persistent gases in order to help out the 155 mm gun. This is in accordance with the present program for loading gas shell and applies particularly to the 8-inch and 240 mm howitzer. Few ideally persistent or non-persistent gases. Naturally, there will be very few gases that are ideally non-persistent or ideally persistent. The groups will merge into one another. Those on the border line will be arbitrarily assigned to one group or the other. It might be said definitely, however, that a gas which will linger more than 6 or possibly 8 hours under any conditions, except great cold, will not be considered non-persistent. For reasons of efficiency and economy, persistent gases will not be chosen unless they will persist under ordinary conditions for 2 or 3 days or more. Accordingly, a gas which would persist for 1 day only would have to be extraordinarily useful to lead to its adoption. Firing non-persistent gases. Of the non-persistent gases, phosgene is the type and the one most used at present. Furthermore, so far as can now be foreseen, it will continue to be the non-persistent gas most used. It volatilizes very quickly upon the bursting of the shell. Accordingly, in order that the shell fired at the beginning of a gas shoot, as they are generally referred to in the field, shall still be effective when the last shell are fired, it is necessary that the whole number be fired within 2 to 3 minutes. The temperature and velocity of the wind both affect this. If it be in a dead calm, the time may be considerably extended; if in a considerable wind, it must be shortened. Another important consideration requiring the rapid firing of non-persistent gases is the fact that nearly all masks thoroughly protect against phosgene and similar gases. It is accordingly necessary to take the enemy unawares and gas him before he can adjust his mask, otherwise, practically no harm will result. From the considerations previously mentioned, these gas chutes are usually made at night when, as before stated, carelessness, sleepiness and the resulting confusion of battle conditions always ensure more casualties than firing gas in the daytime. Firing persistent gases. The persistent gases will be fired by all caliber guns, but to a less extent by the 155 mm than by the other calibers. Persistent gases must be sufficiently effective in low concentrations to act more or less alone. If it be desirable to fill an atmosphere over a given area with mustard gas, the firing may extend for 2 or 3, or even 5 or 6 hours and all shells still act together. The same is true of bromobenzylcyanide. This, then, permits the minimum number of guns to be used in firing these persistent gases. Inasmuch as they persist and force the wearing of the mask, they are available for use in long-range, large-caliber guns for interdiction firing on crossroads, in villages, and on woods that afford hiding places, as well as on other similar concentration points. Firing irritant gases. The irritant gases will be fired by the various caliber guns, in the same manner as the persistent and non-persistent gases. We will have non-persistent irritant gases and persistent irritant gases. They are, however, considered as a group because they are used for harassing purposes, due to their efficiency in forcing the wearing of the mask. Before the signing of the armistice, the General Staff (AEF) had authorized, beginning January 1, 1919, the filling of 25% of all shell with chemical warfare materials. The interpretation there given to shell was that it included both shrapnel and high explosive. Of the field guns in use, the 75 mm will be best, up to the limit of its range, for persistent gases such as mustard gas, and the tear gas, bromobenzylcyanide. A considerable number, however, were filled with non-persistent gases and probably will continue to be so, since, due to the very large number of 75 mm guns available, they can be used to add greatly at times to the amount of non-persistent gas that can be fired upon a given point. Use of gas by the aviation service. No gas was used by aeroplanes in the World War. Many rumors were spread during the latter part of the war to the effect that the Germans had dropped gas here or there from aeroplanes. Every such report reaching the Chemical Warfare Service headquarters was run down and in every case was found to be incorrect. However, there was absolutely no reason for not so using gas, except that the German was afraid. In the early days of the use of gas he did not have enough gas, nor had he developed the use of aeroplanes to the point where it would have seemed advisable. When, however, he had the aeroplanes the war had not only begun to go against him, but he had become particularly fearful of gas and of aeroplane bombing. It does not seem to be generally known, but it is a fact, that after 3 or 4 months' propaganda he made a direct appeal to the Allies to stop the use of gas sometime during the month of March, 1918. This propaganda took the form of an appeal by a professor of chemistry who had access to Switzerland, to prevent the annihilation of the Allied forces by a German gas that was to make its appearance in 1918. This German professor claimed that, while favoring the Germans winning the war, he had too much human sympathy to desire to see the slaughter that would be caused by the use of the new gas. The Allies in the field felt that this was simply an expression of fear and that he did not have such a gas. The Germans were accordingly informed that the Allies would not give up the use of gas. Later events proved these conclusions to be absolutely correct. The German evidently felt that the manufacturing possibilities of the Allies would put them in a more predominant position with gas than with anything else. In that he was exactly correct. The use of gas by aeroplanes will not differ from its use in artillery or by chemical warfare troops. Non-persistent gases may be dropped on the field of battle, upon concentration points, in rest areas, or other troop encampments to produce immediate casualties. Persistent gases will be dropped particularly around crossroads, railroad yards, concentration points and encampments that cannot be reached by the artillery. The sprinkling of persistent gases will be one of the best ways for aeroplanes to distribute gas. It might be said here that the aviation gas bomb will be highly efficient, inasmuch as it has to be only strong enough to withstand the low pressure of the gas and ordinary handling. Whereas artillery shell must be strong enough to withstand the shock of discharge in the gun. Infantry and gas warfare. When one suggests the possibility of the infantry handling gas, it is at once argued that the infantry is already overloaded. That is true, but in the future, as in the past, the infantryman will increase or decrease his load of a given material just as its efficiency warrants. If he finds that gas will get casualties and help him win victories more readily than an equal weight of any other material, he will carry gas material. A study of the articles of equipment abandoned by 10,000 stragglers in the British Army picked up during the Great German Drive towards Amiens in March, 1918, illustrates this very clearly. Of the equipment carried by these stragglers, more than 6,000 had discarded their rifles. The helmets were thrown away to a somewhat less extent, but the gas mask had been thrown away by only 800 out of the 10,000. Now the gas mask is not a particularly easy thing to carry, nor was the English type comfortable to wear, but the English soldier had learned that in a gas attack he had no chance whatever of escape if his gas mask failed him. Accordingly, he hung on to the mask when he had discarded nearly everything else in his possession. The same thing will be true of any gas equipment if it proves its worth. Smoke and incendiary materials. So far nothing has been said in regard to smoke or incendiary materials. This has been due to the fact that their use is not dependent upon weather conditions to anything near the extent that gas is. Second, the smokes, not being poisonous, are not a danger to our own troops, although they may hamper movements and add to the difficulty of taking a position, if used improperly. Of the two classes of materials, smoke and incendiary, smoke materials may be said to be at least 1,000 times as important as the incendiary materials. A material that will burst into flame when a shell is opened or that will scatter balls of burning fire appeals to the popular imagination, and yet actual results achieved by such materials on the field of battle have been almost nil. About the only results worthwhile achieved by incendiary materials have been in occasionally firing ammunition dumps and more frequently, setting fire to warehouses and other storage places. This will undoubtedly continue in the future. Flame-thrower. Of the incendiary materials the least valuable is the flame-thrower. In the chemical warfare service it has been the habit for a long while not to mention the flame-thrower at all, unless questions were asked about it. It is mentioned here to forestall the questions. Even the German, who invented it and who, during the 2 years of trench warfare, had full opportunity for developing its use, finally came to using it largely as a means of executing people that he did not want to shoot himself. Men falling in that class were equipped with flame-throwers and sent over the top. The German knew, as did the Allies, that each man with a flame-thrower became a target for every rifle and machine gun nearby. The flame-thrower is very quickly exhausted and then the one equipped with it has no means of offensive action, and in addition, is saddled with a heavy load, hampering all movements, whether to escape or to advance. Inflammable materials. There will probably be some use for materials such as metallic sodium, spontaneously inflammable oils, etc. That will burst into flame and burn when exposed to the air, though white phosphorus is probably equal, and in most cases vastly superior to anything else so far suggested. Phosphorus burns with an unquenchable flame when exposed to the air, whether wet or dry. It is of great value for screening purposes, and for use against the enemy's troops. The German did not use phosphorus simply because he did not have it, just as he did not use helium in his observation balloons because he did not have it. The value of phosphorus was just beginning to be realized slightly when the Americans entered the war, while its full value was not appreciated even by the American troops when the war closed. The work of the 1st Gas Regiment with phosphorus against machine gun nests proved how valuable it is against the enemy's troops. It proved also its tremendous value as a screen. The Chemical Warfare Service was prepared to fill a great number of artillery shell with phosphorus, but due to the failure of our shell program to mature before the armistice, phosphorus was not used by American artillery to any appreciable extent. Smoke used by everyone. Smoke will be used by every fighting arm of the service in practically every battle, both by day and by night. If you have ever tried on a target range to shoot at a target that was just beginning to be obscured by a fog, you will recognize the difficulty of hitting anything by firing through an impenetrable smoke screen. It is simply a shot in the dark. Future battles will witness smoke formed by smoke candles that are kept in the trenches or carried by the troops, by smoke from bursting artillery shell and rifle grenades, by smoke from aeroplane bombs, and possibly even from what is known as the smoke knapsack. The knapsack produces a very dense white smoke and very economically, but will probably not be much used. This is because, notwithstanding its efficiency, the knapsack cannot be projected to a distance, that is, the smoke screen is generated on the person carrying the knapsack. On the other hand, the great value of phosphorus is that it can be fired to great distances in rifle grenades or artillery shell, and dropped from aviation bombs. The smoke screen is thus established in front of the object it is desired to cut off, whether it be a battery of artillery, an advancing wave of infantry, or a lookout station. Thus smoke, for screening purposes alone, will be used to a tremendous extent. It will also be used in conjunction with gas. Smoky appearance of gas cloud. Due to the smoky appearance of an ordinary gas cloud and to the coming use of poisonous smokes, no one on the field of battle in the future will ever be certain that any given smoke cloud is not also a poisonous cloud until he has actually tested it. And there lies an opportunity for the most intense study and for the greatest use of the proverbial American ingenuity that war has ever furnished. In the variations that can be played with smoke containing gas, or not containing gas, with smoke hurled long distances by the artillery or dropped from aeroplanes, the possibilities indeed are unlimited. Every officer will need to study the possibilities of smoke, both in its use against him and in his use of it against the enemy. He can probably save more casualties among his own troops by the skillful use of smoke than by any other one thing at his command. On the other hand, the unskilled use of smoke on the part of one side in a battle may lead to very great casualties in proportion to those of the enemy should the latter use his smoke skillfully. This is a subject that deserves deep and constant study. Protection by smoke clouds. Smoke in the future will be the greatest protective device available to the soldier. It shuts out not only the view in daylight, but the searching of ground at night by searchlights, by star bombs or other means for illuminating the battlefield. It has already been used extensively by the Navy and undoubtedly will be used far more extensively in the future. Shell markings. Modern artillery shell have distinctive colors for high explosive, for shrapnel, for incendiary materials, and for gases. A grayish color has been adopted as the general color of the paint on all gas shells, bombs and cylinders. In addition, a system of colored bands has been adopted. These bands are white to indicate poisonous non-persistent substances, and red, persistent. Yellow is used to indicate smoke. With any given combination of red and white and yellow bands, the artilleryman at the front can tell, at a glance, whether the gas is non-persistent or whether it is persistent, and also whether or not it contains smoke. There will be secondary markings on each shell which, to the trained chemical warfare service officer, will indicate the particular gas or gases in the shell. These markings, however, will be inconspicuous and no attempt will be made to give the information to the soldier or even to the average officer firing gas. These secondary markings are for the purpose of enabling the chemical warfare service officers in charge to use certain gases for particular uses in those comparatively rare cases when sufficient gas is on hand and sufficient time available to enable such a choice to be made. Chapter 24. Defense against gas. From the field point of view. The best defense against any implement of war is a vigorous offense with the same implement. This is a military axiom that cannot be too often, or too greatly emphasized, though like other axioms it cannot be applied too literally. It needs a proper interpretation, the interpretation varying with time and circumstances. Thus in gas warfare, a vigorous offense with gas is the best defense against gas. This does not mean that the enemy's gas can be ignored. Indeed, It is more important to make use of all defensive measures against gas than it is against any other form of attack. Gas, being heavier than air, rolls along the ground, filling dugouts, trenches, woods and valleys, just the places that are safest from bullets and high explosives. There it remains for hours after it has blown away in the open, and, since the very air itself is poisoned, it is necessary not only that protection be general but that it be continuous during the whole time the gas is present. Earliest protective appliances. The earliest protection against gas was the crudest sort of a mask. The first gas used was chlorine, and since thousands of people in civil life were used to handling it, many knew that certain solutions, as hyposulfite of soda, would readily destroy it. They also knew that if the breath could be drawn through material saturated with those solutions, the chlorine would be destroyed. Thus it was that the first masks were simple cotton, or cotton waste pads, which were dipped into hyposulfite of soda solutions and applied to the mouth and nose during a gas attack. These pads were awkward, unsanitary, and, due to the long intervals between gas attacks, were frequently lost, while the solution itself was often spilled or evaporated. The net result of all this was poor protection and disgust with the so-called masks. Design of new masks. After using these, or similar poor excuses for a mask, for a few weeks, the British designed what was known as the PH helmet. In a gas attack the sack was pulled over the head and tucked under the blouse around the neck, the gas-tight fit being obtained by buttoning the blouse over the ends of the sack. This PH helmet was quite successful against chlorine and, to a much less extent, against phosgene, a new gas introduced during the spring of 1916. But it was warm and stuffy in summer, the very time when gas is used to the greatest extent, while the chemicals in the cloth irritated the face and eyes, especially when combined with some of the poisonous gases. Probably as a result of experience with oxygen apparatus in mine rescue work, Colonel Harrison suggested making a mask of which the principal part was a box filled with chemicals and carried on the chest. A flexible tube connected the box with a mouthpiece of rubber. Breathing was thus through the mouth, and in order to ensure that no air would be breathed in through the nose, a noseclip was added. This, of course, cared for the lungs, but did not protect the eyes. Their protection was secured by making a facepiece of rubberized cloth with elastics to hold it tight against the face. The efficiency of this mask depends, then, first upon the ability of the facepiece to keep out lacrimatory gases which affect the eyes, and, second, upon a proper combination of chemicals in the box. To purify the air drawn into the lungs through the mouthpiece. Details are given in. Protection against smoke. While the charcoal and soda-lime granules furnished an adequate protection against all known true gases, they did not furnish protection against certain smokes or against minute particles of liquid gas. Since certain smokes, as stannic chloride, though not deadly, are so highly irritating as to make life unbearable, it early became necessary to devise means for keeping them from going through the masks. This was done in the first masks by adding a sufficient thickness of cotton batting. The cotton was usually placed in 3 layers alternating with the charcoal and granules, as it was thought the latter would be held in place better by that means. Some time after stannic chloride came into use, the Germans started firing shells containing a small quantity of diphenylchloroarsine, popularly known as sneezing gas. Protection against this is discussed in Choice of masks for U.S. troops. When it became necessary, with the creation of a chemical warfare service in France in August 1917, to decide upon a mask for American troops, there were available for purchase 2 types, the British type and the French M2. The French M2 consisted essentially of 32 layers of cloth impregnated with various chemicals, through which the air was breathed both in and out. This mask was quite effective against ordinary field concentrations of most gases, but was utterly inadequate to care for the high concentration of phosgene obtained in the front line from cloud gas or from projector gas attacks. It was also poor against chloropicrin. The M2 was, however, very light and easy to carry, and moreover was deemed sufficient to protect against concentrations of cloud gas even at points more than 5 miles distant from the front line. Furthermore, it was felt desirable at first to have an auxiliary or emergency mask in addition to the principal one, for use in case the principal mask was worn out or damaged. Accordingly, both types of masks were adopted, and the day after Fries took charge of the Chemical Warfare Service, AEF. On August 22, 1917, 100,000 of each were purchased, although there were then only 10 or 12,000 American troops in France requiring masks. Later additional masks of both kinds were purchased to tide over the American troops until a sufficient quantity of the British-type masks could be manufactured in the United States. The total of British masks purchased amounted to about 700,000. However, within a comparatively short time after American troops got into the front line, it was realized that a second mask, inferior in protection to the first, was highly undesirable. During a gas attack, men seemed to acquire an uncontrollable desire to shift from one mask to the other. This shifting in nearly every case resulted in a casualty. We then came rapidly to the conclusion that one mask only should be furnished, and that one the best that could be made, and then to impress upon the soldier the fact that his life depended upon the care he took of his mask. This proved to be an entirely sound conclusion, as the number of men gassed through injuries to the mask was comparatively small. An interesting proof of the value the soldier placed upon his mask was shown by the articles of equipment thrown away by 10,000 British stragglers in the Great German Offensive of March, 1918. Of the articles thus thrown away, the gas mask came at the foot of the list, with only 800 missing. The steel helmet is said to have come next with about 4,000 missing. Sizes of faces for masks. When adopting the British respirator in August, 1917, it was decided that the American face as well as the American stature was probably larger than the English. Accordingly, inquiry was made in regard to the sizes of masks issued to the Canadians, as it was thought probable they required a greater proportion of the larger size masks than did the English. When prescribing the relative quantities of each size of mask to be furnished Americans, the Canadian requirements were taken as a base, but with the larger sizes increased slightly over the Canadian requirements. As a matter of fact, even these increases proved considerably too small, so that the numbers in the two sizes above normal had to be finally more than doubled. Objections to German-type mask. The American gas service felt from the beginning that a design which attached the box of chemicals to the facepiece was unsound in principle. This design was used in the German mask and in the French RS masks, since it did not allow proper flexibility for increasing the size of the box to care for new gases. Furthermore, the weight of the box during movement caused the facepiece to swing slightly from side to side. This interfered with vision and tended to lift the facepiece away from the face and allow gas to enter. That the objections of the American gas service to this type were correct was proved by the difficulty encountered toward the end of the war by both the French and the Germans in trying to provide a suitable filter for protection against particulate clouds and the smokes, such as stannic chloride and diphenylchloroarsine. Struggle between mask and gas. As between the mask and poisonous gases, we have the old struggle of the battleship armor against the armor-piercing projectile. While the armor-piercing projectile has always had a little the better of the game, it is just the reverse with gases. The gas mask has always been just a little better than the gases, so that very few casualties have occurred through failure of the mask itself. This margin of safety has never been any too great, and that we have had a margin at all is due to the energy, skill and enthusiasm of those developing and manufacturing masks in England, France, and particularly in the United States. However, the mask at the best is uncomfortable, causes some loss of vigor, and even with the very best American masks there is some loss in vision. The wearing effect on troops results mostly from the increased resistance to breathing. Accordingly, a tremendous amount of study and effort was made to decrease this breathing resistance. In the English-type masks this resistance was equal to the vacuum required to raise a column of water about 4½ inches. Adding the sulfite paper to protect against diphenylchloroarsine increased this resistance by about 1 inch. This put a heavy burden on the wearer of the mask whenever it was necessary for him to do any manual labor while wearing it. In addition, earlier masks left a good deal to be desired in the way of reducing resistance by proper-sized tubes, angles and valves through which the air was drawn. This was much more easily overcome than reducing the resistance through the chemicals and charcoal and the materials for protection against diphenylchloroarsine. In the latest type canister, devised after long trials for the American forces, this resistance was brought down to about 2 inches of water. What this reduction in resistance means no one knows except one who has worn the old mask with its mouthpiece and 4 to 6 inches resistance and has then replaced that mask for one through which he breathes naturally with only 2 inches. Resistance. Design of new American mask. The American Gas Service felt from the beginning that the mouthpiece and noseclip must be abandoned and bent every effort toward getting a mask perfected for that purpose. The English opposed this view fiercely for nearly a year. This position on the part of the English was more or less natural. They developed their mask in the beginning for protection against cloud gas. In those days the opposing trenches were close together. Moreover, front-line trenches were quite strongly manned. The result was that a large number of men were exposed to a very high concentration of gas, but, and highly important, for a short period only. Inasmuch as the German feared this cloud gas even more than the English, there was no danger of his attacking in it. The English rules of conduct during a gas attack called for all movement to stop and for every man to stand ready until the cloud passed. Accordingly, the man was breathing the easiest possible and hence did not suffer particularly from the resistance. With the advent of mustard gas, however, the whole general scheme of protection changed. Mustard gas, as is well known, is effective in extremely low concentrations and has very great persistency. In dry warm weather mustard gas, scattered on the ground and shrubbery, will not be fully evaporated for 2 to 3 days and accordingly will give off vapors that not only burn the lungs and eyes but the soft, moist parts of the skin as well. In cool, damp weather the gas remains in dangerous quantity for a week and occasionally longer. Since this gas, in liquid form, evaporates too slowly for use in gas clouds, it is used altogether in bombs and shells. Accordingly it could be expected to be and actually is fired at all ranges from the front line to nearly 8 miles back of that line. Hence, with the coming of mustard gas, the need for protection changed from high protection for a short period to moderate protection for very long periods. Indeed, mustard gas makes it necessary for men to wear masks just as long as they remain in an area infected with it. There is still occasional need for high protection for short periods, but with the increase in the efficiency of charcoal alone. It is found that the amount of charcoal and chemicals in the canister can be very greatly reduced and still maintain sufficient protection for the high concentrations encountered in cloud gas and projector attacks. Exhaustion and malingering. It seems physically impossible for the ordinary man to wear the British mask with its mouthpiece and noseclip more than 6 to 8 hours, and vast numbers are unable to even do that. How many thousands of casualties were suffered through men losing their mental balance from exhaustion and the discomfort of the mouthpiece and noseclip no one knows. Such men tore off the mask, stating that they would rather die than endure the torture of wearing it longer. Furthermore, the poor vision of this mask led to the habit of taking the facepiece off while still leaving the mouthpiece and noseclip in place. This gave protection to the lungs, but exposed the eyes, and as mustard gas affects the eyes very readily, this alone led to thousands of casualties. There was another interesting side to this situation. The malingerer who wanted to get out of the front line and was willing to take any action, however cowardly, to achieve that end, deliberately removed the facepiece and thus suffered gassing of the eyes. The effect of mustard gas soon became so well known that the malingerer knew gassing of the eyes never resulted in death or permanent loss of sight. With the new type of American mask, the protection of eyes and lungs depends solely upon the fit around the face and no such playing with the mask can be done. Without going into further details in regard to masks, it is sufficient to state that at the end the Americans had produced a mask thoroughly comfortable, giving complete protection against gases and smoke clouds. And one that was easy to manufacture on the huge scale, 50 to 75,000 per day, which was necessary to provide masks for an army of 3 to 4 million men in the field. Protection in war is relative only. Napoleon is credited with saying, in order to make an omelette, it is necessary to break some eggs. Every student of war realizes that casualties cannot be avoided in battle, and yet one American staff officer went so far as to refuse to use gas offensively unless the Chemical Warfare Service could absolutely guarantee that not a single American casualty could occur under any circumstances. This same idea early got into the heads of the laboratory workers on masks. They seemed to feel that if a single gas casualty occurred through failure of the mask, their work would be a failure, or at least they would be open to severe criticism. Accordingly, efforts were made to perfect masks and to perfect protection regardless of the discomfort imposed upon the wearer of the mask. This idea was very difficult to eradicate. The laboratory worker who accustoms himself to experiment with a particular thing forgets that he develops an ability to endure discomfort that is not possible of attainment by the ordinary man in the time available for his training. Furthermore, if the need for such training can be avoided, it is of course highly desirable. This applies to the mouthpiece of the British respirator, to elastics that cause undue discomfort to the face, to the nose clip, and to the large boxes that cause too great resistance to breathing. It may be taken as a general rule that when protection requires so much effort or becomes so much of a burden that the average man cannot or will not endure it, it is high time to find out what the average man will stand and then provide it, even if some casualties result. Protection in battle is always relative. A man who cannot balance protection against legitimate risk has no business passing on arms, equipment, or tactics to be used in battle. Training. Bitter experience taught the Allies as well as the Americans that no matter how efficient the gas mask and other defensive appliances, they would not take the place of thorough and constant training. One of the greatest difficulties at first was to get American troops to realize that a thing as invisible as gas, with in many cases no offensive smell and producing no immediate discomfort, could be deadly. Nothing but constant drill and constant reiteration of these dangers could get this fact impressed on them. Indeed, it never was impressed sufficiently in any of the earlier divisions of American troops in the line to prevent their taking such chances that each division suffered heavy loss on one or more occasions from gas attacks. A great deal of emphasis had been placed by the English upon the adjustment of the mask in the shortest possible time, this time having been officially set at 6 seconds after the alarm. The Americans, in adopting the mask in toto, naturally had to adopt the rules for adjusting it and wearing it. Experience, however, taught them in a few months that the effort to attain too great speed was dangerous. It tended to rattle the soldier and to result in poor adjustment of the mask, both of which led to casualties. Accordingly, in the latest instructions for defense against gas, all reference to 6 seconds was eliminated and emphasis placed on the necessity of accurate adjustment of the mask. Inasmuch as any man, practically without effort or previous drill, can hold his breath for 20 seconds, the need for great speed in adjusting the mask is not apparent. Holding the breath. The first regulations, and those in general use up to near the close of hostilities, prescribed that the soldier should hold his breath and adjust his mask. It seemed impossible to overcome the natural inference that, holding the breath, meant first the drawing of a full breath. This was obviously highly dangerous if gas were actually present before the alarm was heard, as was often the case with projector and artillery gas shell attacks. The change was then made to the phrase, "Stop breathing and stay stopped until the mask is carefully and accurately adjusted." Psychology in training. While the importance of impressing upon the soldier the danger of gas was early appreciated, it was deemed necessary not to make him unduly afraid of the gas. However, as gas defense training in our army got a big start over gas offense training, this became a matter of very great importance. In fact, due to a variety of causes, training in the offensive use of gas was not available for any troops until after their arrival in France. This resulted in officers and men looking upon the gas game, so far as they were individually concerned, as one of defense only. Accordingly, after their arrival in France, it became very difficult not only to get some of our officers to take up the offensive use of gas but even to get them to permit its use along the front they commanded. Notwithstanding all the care taken in training Americans in gas defense, there arose an undue fear of the gas that had to be overcome in order to get our troops to attack close enough to their own gas to make it effective. This applied to the use of gas by artillery as well as to its use by gas troops. However, it should be said that in every instance where gas was once used on an American front, all officers in the division, or other unit, affected by it were always thereafter strongly in favor of it. German problems in gas training. The Germans also had serious troubles of their own over the psychology of gas training. As stated elsewhere, they were using mustard gas nearly 11 months before the Allies began using it. During that time, for purposes of morale, if not sheer boastfulness, the Germans told their men that mustard gas could not be made by the Allies. That it was by far the worst thing the war had produced, and in that statement they were correct, and that they would win the war with it, in which statement they were far from correct. When the Allies began sending it back to them, they had to reverse their teachings and tell their men that mustard gas was no worse than anything else. That they need not be afraid of it, and that their masks and other protective appliances gave full protection against it. They thus had a problem in psychology which they never succeeded in fully solving. Indeed, there is no question but that the growing fear of gas in the minds of the German is one of the reasons that prompted him to his early capitulation. Gas at night. In the early days it was very difficult to get officers to realize the absolute necessity of night drill in the adjustment of the mask. For various reasons, including surprise, gas attacks were probably 80 to 90% of the time carried out at night. Under such conditions, confusion in the adjustment of the mask is inevitable without a great deal of practice beforehand, especially for duty in trenches with narrow spaces and sharp projecting corners. There are numerous instances of men waking up and getting excited, who not only gassed themselves, but in their mad efforts to find their masks, or to escape from the gas, knocked others down, disarranging their masks and causing the gassing of from 1 to 3 or 4 additional men. The confusion inherent in any gas attack was heightened in the latter stages of the war by heavy shrapnel and high explosive bombardments that accompanied nearly all projector and cloud gas attacks for that very purpose. The bombardment was continued for 3 or 4 hours to cause exhaustion and removal of the mask and to prevent the removal of the gassed patients from the gassed area. Detection of gases. Efforts were made by the enemy and by all the Allies throughout the war to invent a mechanical detector that would show when gas was present in dangerous quantities. While scores, perhaps hundreds, of these were invented, none proved simple, quick, or certain enough in action to make their adoption desirable. In every case it was necessary to rely on the sense of smell. Thus it was that as the war wore on, more and more attention was given to training officers and non-commissioned officers to detect various kinds of gases in dangerous quantities by the sense of smell. In the American Gas Defense School for officers this was done wholly by using captured German gases. This was because certain gases have quite different smells, depending upon the impurities in the gas and also upon the solvents sometimes mixed with them. Thus the German mustard gas has a mustard smell, while the Allies' mustard gas, due to a slight difference in the method of manufacture, has a very perfect garlic odor. Not only must officers and men who handle gas training know the smell of the various gases, but they must know when the concentration of each is high enough to be dangerous. This is not easy to learn because the strength of the various gases in dangerous concentrations varies through wide limits. Not only does the strength of the gases vary and the sharpness of the odors accordingly, but the mingling of poisonous gases with other gases from high explosive and shrapnel tends to obscure these odors and make them more difficult of detection. Deceptive gases. A great deal of thought was given toward the end of the war to the subject of deceptive gases which could by powerful or peculiar odors mask the dangerous gases. This masking was to deceive the enemy when dangerous gases were present or to admit an attack without masks while the enemy was wearing his through thinking there was a dangerous gas when as a matter of fact none existed. In gas warfare, the German, as well as the Allies, was exercising his ingenuity in devising new and startling methods of making gas attacks. A well-known trick with the German was to fire gases for several days, particularly against green troops, in concentrations so slight as to do no harm. When he felt that he had lulled those troops to a sense of the ineffectiveness of his gas, he sent over a deadly concentration. In spite of the warning that this was what was happening, he often achieved too great a success. Before the war closed, however, the American was beginning to outthink and outwit the German in this method of warfare. Mustard gas burns. With the advent of mustard gas which burned the body, a new and serious difficulty in protection arose. At first it was thought mustard gas burned only when the liquid from the bursting shell actually splashed on the clothing or skin. This was unfortunately soon found to be not true. The gas itself rapidly penetrates clothing and burns the skin even when the concentration of the gas is very low. Probably the majority of burns from mustard gas arose from concentrations of gas consisting of less than 1 part of gas to 500,000 of air. Furthermore, the gas is fully 50% cumulative in its effects, that is, in extremely low concentrations over a period of hours it will produce more than 50% the effect that a far higher concentration would produce in a relatively shorter time. The Allies were not long in discovering that oilcloth afforded very complete protection against mustard gas. The ordinary oilcloth, however, was too thick, too hot and too heavy for general use. Experiments soon showed that cloth thoroughly impregnated with boiled linseed oil would give protection. In order to make this protection more perfect, a certain amount of paraffin was added. All this made the clothing airtight, rather stiff and always uncomfortable. Notwithstanding these discomforts, hundreds of thousands of oiled suits, and as many pairs of oiled gloves were made and issued to artillery troops, and to troops especially charged with handling mustard gas shells, or to those employed in destroying mustard gas in shell holes by spreading chloride of lime over them. The importance of protection against mustard gas burns led to extensive researches being made with a view to finding a cloth which would be comfortable and porous and while stopping mustard gas would yet be sufficiently durable and comfortable to be issued to infantry troops as well as to artillery and other special troops. This, it is understood, had been achieved just prior to the armistice. Still more desirable would be the discovery of a chemical substance which could be applied to all uniforms and army clothing and thus protect the regulation clothing against the penetration of mustard gas, and thereby avoid carrying extra clothing for that special purpose. Protecting troops by moving them from infected areas. As soon as it was fully realized that mustard gas persisted for several days, it was decided to run complete reliefs of men into and out of areas that had been heavily shelled with mustard gas. Or better still, where practicable, to completely evacuate the area. Inasmuch as the gas is dangerous to friend and foe alike, this method was comparatively safe and was used to a very considerable extent. With the warfare of movement that existed over most of the active front throughout the season of 1918, this moving of troops out of infected areas became highly important and, when skillfully done, often resulted in a great saving of troops and at the same time prevented the enemy from receiving any particular tactical advantage from his mustard gas attacks. There was one very excellent example of this a few miles to the northwest of Château-Thierry prior to the counteroffensive of July 18, 1918. At that time the Germans heavily shelled with mustard gas 4 or 5 small woods and 2 or 3 villages. It was necessary for the men to stay in these woods during the day, as they afforded the only protection obtainable from machine guns, shrapnel and high explosive. At the time this occurred, American gas officers generally understood the necessity of getting troops out of a mustard gas-infected area. Accordingly, all began searching for places safe from the mustard gas. In one particular instance, the gas officer of a regiment discovered that a portion of the woods his men were in was free from the gas, and the regimental commander, promptly following his advice, moved his troops into the free area. As a result of this prompt action, the regiment had only 4 light gas casualties, although all told there were several hundred mustard gas casualties in this attack. The number per thousand generally being from 10 to 20 times that of the 1,000 men just mentioned. Mixing poisonous gases. On this as well as other occasions the Germans fired some diphosgene and Blue Cross, sneezing gas, as well as mustard gas. This added to the difficulty of determining areas free from the latter. In the future such mixing of poisonous gases may always be expected and, in addition, gases which have no value other than that of masking the poisonous ones will be fired. While with practically all gases except mustard gas a man is comparatively safe while breathing a concentration very noticeable to the sense of smell. The only safe rule with mustard gas is to consider as dangerous any concentration that can be smelled. For the reason that this gas persists longer in calm areas, woods are always to be avoided, where practicable, and also, since all gases, being heavier than air, tend to roll into depressions and valleys, they should be avoided. There have been a number of authentic cases where batteries in hollows or valleys suffered severely from mustard gas, while troops on nearby knolls or ridges were comparatively free. Though the difference in the amount of shelling of the two places was not noticeable. Of great importance with all gases is the posting of a sufficient number of sentries around men sleeping within the range of gas shell. The worst projector gas attack against the Americans was one where the projectors were landed among a group of dugouts containing men asleep without sentries. The result was a very heavy casualty list, coupled with a high death rate, the men being gassed in their sleep before they were awakened. Destruction of mustard gas. Prior to the introduction of mustard gas, all that was necessary to get rid of gas was to thoroughly ventilate the spot. Thus in trenches and dugouts, fires were found to be very efficient, simply because they produced a circulation of air. In the early days, among the British, the Ayrton fan, a sort of canvas scoop, was used to throw the gas out of the trenches. While this was taken up in the American service, it did not become very important, since it was found that, under ordinary atmospheric conditions, natural ventilation soon carried the gas out of the trench proper. While fires in dugouts were far more efficient than the fans. Likewise the Ayrton fan smacked too much of trench warfare, which had reached a condition of stalemate, a condition that never appealed to the Americans and a condition that it is hoped never will. With mustard gas, however, conditions were entirely changed. This liquid, having a very high boiling point and evaporating very slowly, remains for days in the earth and on vegetation and other material sprinkled with it. This was particularly true in shell holes where the force of the explosion drove the gas into the earth around the broken edges of the hole. While many substances were experimented with, that which proved best and most practical under all conditions, was chloride of lime. This was used to sprinkle in shell holes, on floors of dugouts and any other places where the liquid might be splashed from bursting shells. It was also found very desirable to have a small box of this at the entrance to each dugout, so that a person who had been exposed to mustard gas could thoroughly coat his shoes with it and thus kill the mustard gas that collected in the mud on the bottom and sides of his shoes. Carrying mustard gas on clothing. There are many instances where the occupants of dugouts were gassed from the gas on the shoes and clothing of men entering the dugout. Not only were occupants of dugouts thus gassed, but a number of nurses and doctors were gassed while working in closed rooms over patients suffering from mustard gas poisoning. Even under the conditions of warfare existing where the Americans were generally in action, the quantity of chloride of lime required amounted to several hundred tons per month, which had to be shipped from the United States. Chloride of lime was also very convenient to have at hand around shell dumps for the purpose of covering up leaky shells. Though rules for handling mustard gas shells usually prescribed that they be fired and where that was not practicable to bury them at least 5 feet under the surface of the ground. This depth was not so much for the purpose of getting rid of the gas as it was to get the shell so deep into the ground that it would not be a danger in any cultivation that might later take place. Mustard gas in cold weather. Much was learned toward the end of the war about ways of getting through or around areas infected with mustard gas. For instance, if mustard gas be fired and the weather is in the neighborhood of freezing or somewhat below, it will remain on the ground at night with so little evaporation as not to be dangerous. The same will be true during the daytime if the weather is cloudy as well as cold. If, however, the days are bright and the nights cold, mustard-gassed areas can be safely crossed by troops at night provided care is taken in brush and bushes to protect the feet and clothing from the liquid splashed on bushes. If the sun comes out warm in the morning, such areas may be quite dangerous for 3 to 4 hours following sunup and indeed for the greater part of the day. Quite a large number of casualties were ascribed to this fact in the heavy attack on the British front west of Cambrai just prior to the Great German Drive against Amiens, March 21, 1918. Degassing units. Since mustard gas has a greatly delayed action, it was found that if men who had been exposed to it could be given a thorough bath with soap and water within a half hour or even a full hour, the mustard gas burns would be prevented or very greatly reduced in severity. Accordingly, degassing units were developed consisting essentially of a 5-ton truck with a 1,200-gallon water tank, fitted with an instantaneous heater and piping to connect it to portable shower baths. Another truck was kept loaded with extra suits of underclothing and uniforms. These degassing units were to be provided at the rate of 2 per division. Then, in the event of a mustard gas attack anywhere in the division, one of these units would be rushed to that vicinity and the men brought out of the line and given a bath and change of clothing as soon as possible. At the same time they were given a drink of bicarbonate of soda water and their eyes, ears, mouth and nasal passages washed with the same. Protecting food from mustard gas. It was very early learned that mustard gas, or minute particles of the liquid gas settling on food, caused the stomach to be burned if the food were eaten, just as the eyes, lungs and skin of the body are burned from gas in the air. This made it necessary then to see that all food liable to exposure to mustard gas attacks was protected, and tarred paper for box linings or tops was found by the gas service to furnish one of the cheapest and most available means of doing this. Alarm signals. Numerous, indeed, were the devices invented at one time or another with which to sound gas alarms. The English early devised the Strombass horn, a sort of trumpet operated by compressed air contained in cylinders carried for that purpose. Its note is penetrating and can be heard, under good conditions, for 3 or 4 miles. When cloud gas attacks, which occurred only at intervals of 2 to 4 months, were the only gas attacks to be feared, it was easy enough to provide for alarm signals by methods as cumbersome and as technically delicate as the Strombass horn. With the advent of shell gas in general, and mustard gas in particular, the number of gas attacks increased enormously. This made it not only impossible, but inadvisable also, to furnish sufficient Strombass horns for all gas alarms, as gas shell attacks are comparatively local. In such cases, if the Strombass horn is used to give warning, it causes troops who are long distances out of the area attacked to take precautions against gas with consequent interference with their work or fighting. To meet these local conditions, metal shell cases were first hung up and the alarm sounded on them. Later steel triangles were used in the same way. At a still later date the large policeman's rattle, well known in Europe, was adopted, and following that the klaxon horn. As the warfare of movement developed, the portability of alarm apparatus became of prime importance. For those reasons the klaxon horn and the police rattle were having a race for popularity when the armistice was signed. A recent gas alarm invention that gives promise is a small siren-like whistle fired into the air like a bomb. It is fitted with a parachute which keeps it from falling too rapidly when the bomb explodes and sets it free. Its tone is said to be very penetrating and to be quite effective over an ample area. Since future gas alarm signals must be efficient and must be portable, the lighter and more compact they can be made the better, hence the desirability of parachute whistles or similar small handy alarms. Issuing new masks. One of the problems that remained unsolved at the end of the war was how to determine when to issue new boxes, or canisters, for masks. One of the first questions asked by the soldier is how long his mask is good in gas, and how long when worn in drill where there is no gas. This information is of course decidedly important. Obviously, however, it is impossible to tell how long a canister will last in a gas attack, unless the concentration of gas is known, that is, the life of the box is longer or shorter as the concentration of gas is weak or heavy. A realization of this need led mask designers to work very hard, long before the necessity for comfort in a mask was as fully realized as it was at the end of the war, to increase the length of life of the canister. To get longer life they increased the chemicals, and this in turn increased the breathing resistance, thereby adding to the discomfort of the soldier when wearing the mask. Finally, however, it was found that in the concentration of gas encountered on an average in the field, the life of the comparatively small American boxes was sufficient to last from 50 to 100 hours. Which is longer than any gas attack, or at least gives time to get out of the gassed area. The British early appreciated the necessity of knowing when boxes should be replaced. They accordingly devised the scheme of furnishing with each mask a very small booklet tied to the carrying case, in which the soldier could not only enter a complete statement of the time he had worn the mask but also the statement as to whether it was in gas or for drill purposes only. The soldier was then taught that if he had worn the mask, say for 40 hours, he should get a new box. But the scheme didn't work. In fact, it was one of those things which foresight might have shown wouldn't work. Indeed, any man who in the hell of battle can keep such a record completely, should be at once awarded a Distinguished Service Medal. As gas warfare developed, not only were all kinds of gas shells sent over in a bunch, but they were accompanied by high explosive, shrapnel and anything else in the way of trouble that the enemy possessed. A man near the front line, under those conditions, had all he could do and frequently more than he could do, to get his mask on and keep it on while doing his bit. Consequently he had no time, even if he had the inclination, to record how long he had the mask in the various gases. In this connection, after the armistice was signed, we in the field were requested to obtain for experimental purposes 10,000 canisters that had been used in battle. Each was to be labeled with the length of time it had been worn in or out of gas, and if in gas, the name of each gas and the time the mask was worn in it. This request is just a sample of what is asked by those who do not realize field conditions. One trip to the front would have convinced the one making the request of the utter impossibility of complying with it, for really no man knows how long he wears a mask in gas. With gas as common and as difficult to detect, when intermingled with high explosive gases and other smells of the battlefield, as it was at the end of the war, each man wore the mask just as long as he could, simply as a matter of precaution. Before hostilities ceased, we were trying out a method of calling in say 50 canisters per division once a week for test in the laboratory. If the tests showed the life of the canisters to be short, new canisters would be issued. While we did not have opportunity to try out this plan, it gave promise of being the best that could be done. With gas becoming an everyday affair, the only other alternative would seem to be to make issues of new boxes at stated intervals. On the other hand, there are no definite records of casualties occurring from the exhaustion of the chemicals in the box. Undoubtedly some did occur, but they were very, very few. In nearly all cases the masks got injured, or the box became rusted through before the chemicals gave out. Tonnage and number of masks required. It will probably be a shock to most people to learn that with more than 2 million men in France we required nearly 1,500 tons of gas material per month. This tonnage was increasing, rather than decreasing, to cover protective suits, gloves, pastes, and chloride of lime, as well as masks. The British-type respirator was estimated to last from 4 to 6 months. The active part of the war, in which the Americans took part, was too short to determine whether this was correct or not. The indications were, however, that it was about right, considering rest periods and fighting periods. With the new American mask, with its much stronger and stiffer face material, the chances are that the life will be considerably increased, although the more constant use of the mask will probably offset its greater durability. A longer life of mask would of course be a decided advantage, as it would not only reduce tonnage, but would reduce manufacturing and distribution as well. The estimates on which we were working at the end looked forward to requiring from the United States about 1/3 pound per man per day for all troops in France. In order to keep them supplied with gas defense material and with the gases used offensively by gas troops. All gas shell, hand grenades, etc., used by other than gas troops required tonnage in addition to the above. Summing up. In summing up then, it is noted that there are several important things in defense against gas. First, the mask which protects the eyes and the lungs. Second, the training that teaches the man how to utilize to best advantage the means of protection at his disposal, whether he be alone or among others. Third, protective clothing that protects hands and feet and the skin in general. Fourth, a knowledge of gases and their tactical use that will enable commanders, whenever possible, to move men out of gas-infected areas. Fifth, training in the offensive use of gas, as well as in defensive methods, to teach the man that gas has no uncanny power and that it is simply one element of war that must be reckoned with. Thus preventing stampedes when there is really no danger. While these are the salient points in defense against gas, above them and beyond them lies the vigorous offensive use of gas. This involves not only the research, development and manufacture of necessary gases in peacetime, but also the necessary training to enable our nation to hurl upon the enemy on the field of battle chemical warfare materials in quantities he cannot hope to attain. Chapter 25. Peacetime Uses of Gas. Peace hath her victories no less renowned than war. Thus runs the old proverb. In ancient times war profited by peace far more than peace profited by war, if indeed the latter ever actually occurred. The implements developed for the chase in peace became the weapons of war. This was true of David's slingshot, of the spear and of the bow. Even powder itself was probably intended and used for scores of years for celebrations and other peaceful events. The World War reversed this story, especially in its later phases. The greater part of the war was fought with implements and machines prepared in peace either for war or for peaceful purposes. Such implements were the aeroplane, submarine, truck, automobile and gasoline motors in general. The first gas attack, which was simply an adaptation of the peacetime use of the chemical chlorine, inaugurated the change. Gas was so new and instantly recognized as so powerful that the best brains in research among all the first-class powers were put to work to develop other gases and other means of projecting them upon the enemy. The result was that in the short space of 3½ years a number of substances were discovered, or experimented with anew, that are aiding today and will continue to aid in the future in the peaceful life of every nation. Chlorine is even more valuable than ever as a disinfectant and water purifier. It is the greatest bleaching material in the world, and has innumerable other uses in the laboratory. Chloropicrin, cyanogen chloride and cyanogen bromide are found to be very well adapted to the killing of weevil and other similar insect destroyers of grain. Hydrocyanic acid gas is the greatest destroyer today of insect pests that otherwise would ruin the beautiful orange and lemon groves of California and the South. Figure 120. Phosgene, so extensively used in the war both in cloud gas and in shell, is finding an ever-increasing use in the making of brilliant dyes, pinks, greens, blues and violets. On account of its cheapness and simplicity of manufacture, it has great possibilities in the destruction of rodents such as rats around wharves, warehouses and similar places that are inaccessible to any other means of reaching those pests. Since phosgene is highly corrosive of steel, iron, copper and brass, it cannot be used successfully in places where those metals are present. Instead of phosgene for killing rodents and the like in storehouses and warehouses, cyanogen bromide has been developed. This is a solid and can be burned like an ordinary sulfur candle. It is much safer for the purpose of fumigating rooms and buildings than is hydrocyanic acid gas when so used. This is for the reason that cyanogen bromide is an excellent lacrimator in quantities too minute to cause any injury to the lungs. It will thus give warning to anyone attempting to enter a place where some of the gas may still linger. Among tear gases, the new chloracetophenone, a solid, is perhaps the greatest of all. When driven off by heat it first appears as a light bluish-colored cloud. This cloud is instantly so irritating to the eyes that within a second anyone in the path of the cloud is temporarily blinded. It causes considerable smarting and very profuse tears which even in the smallest amount continue for 2 to 5 minutes. In greater quantities it would continue longer. So far as can be ascertained, it is absolutely harmless so far as any permanent injuries are concerned. Considering that it is instantly effective, that minute quantities are unbearable to the eyes, that it can be put in hand grenades or other small containers and driven off by a heating mixture which will not ignite even a pile of papers. And that it needs no explosion to burst the grenade, all that is used is a light cap, set off by the action of the spring, sufficient to ignite the burning charge. The future will see every police department in the land outfitted with chloracetophenone or other similar grenades. Every sheriff's office, every jail and every penitentiary will have a supply of them. No jailbreaking, no lynching, no rioting can succeed where these grenades are available. Huge crowds can be set to weeping instantly so that no man can see and no mob will continue once it is blinded with irritating tears. More than that, it is an extremely difficult gas to keep out of masks, ordinary masks of the World War being entirely useless against it. The same is true of diphenylamine chlorarsen. This is not a tear gas but it is extraordinarily irritating to the lungs, throat and nose, where it causes pains and burning sensations, and in higher concentrations vomiting. It is hardly poisonous at all so that it is extremely difficult to get enough to cause danger to life. This is mentioned because of its possible use for the protection of bank vaults, safes, and strong rooms generally. There are many other gases that can be used for this same purpose. It is presumed that gases that are not powerful enough to kill are the ones desired, and there are half a dozen at least that can be so used. If desired deadly gases can just as readily be used. Already a number of inventors are at work on the problem, with some plans practically completely worked out and models made. It has been suggested that one of these gases could be used by trappers in trapping wild animals. Hydrocyanic acid gas may be so used. It acts quickly and is very rapidly dissipated. An animal exposed to the fumes would die quickly and the trap be safe to approach within 2 minutes after it was sprung. It is said that the loss from animals working their way out of traps by one means or another is nearly 20%. More than this, it would meet the objections of the SPCA, in that the animal would not suffer from having its limbs torn and lacerated by the trap. Attempts are being made to attack the locust of the Philippines and the Far West and the boll weevil of the cotton states of the South. So far these tests have not proven more successful than other methods, but inasmuch as the number of gases available for trial are so great and the value of success of so much importance. This research should be continued on a large scale to definitely determine whether poisonous gas can be used to eradicate these pests, especially the boll weevil. As an interesting application of war materials to peaceful uses, we may consider the case of cellulose acetate, known during the war as aeroplane dope, the material used to coat the linen covering aeroplane wings. With a little further manipulation, this cellulose acetate, or aeroplane dope, becomes artificial silk, a silk that today is generally equal to the best natural silk, and which promises in the future to become a standard product better in every way than that from the silkworm. Figure 121. These few examples of the peacetime value of gas are worthy of thought from another standpoint. Being so valuable, their use in peace will not be stopped. If they are thus manufactured and used in peace, they will always be available for use in war, and as the experience of the World War proved, they certainly will be so used even should anybody be foolish enough to try to abolish their use. As for this latter idea, the world might as well recognize at once that halfway measures in war simply invite disaster. This chapter would not be complete without a brief statement of the necessity of a thoroughly developed chemical industry in the United States as a vital national necessity if the United States is to have real preparedness for a future struggle. As will be indicated a little later, no one branch of the chemical industry can be allowed to go out of existence without endangering some part of the scheme of preparedness. Let us consider first the coal tar industry. Coal tar is a byproduct of coke ovens or the manufacture of artificial gas from coal. The coal tar industry is of the utmost importance because in the coal tars are the bases of nearly all of the modern dyes, a large percentage of the modern medicines, most of the modern high explosives, a large proportion of poisonous gases, modern perfumes, and photographic materials. A consideration of these titles alone shows how vital the coal tar industry is. The coal tar as it comes to us as a byproduct is distilled, giving off at different temperatures a series of compounds called crudes. 10 of these are of very great importance. The first 5 are benzene, toluene, naphthalene, anthracene and phenol, carbolic acid. The second group comprises xylene, methylanthrazine, cresol, carbazole and phenanthrene. These, when treated with other chemicals, produce a series of compounds called intermediates, of which there are some 300 now known. From these intermediates by different steps are produced either dyes, high explosives, poisonous gases, pharmaceuticals, perfumes or photographic materials. We have all heard that Germany controlled the dye industry of the world prior to the World War. A little study of the above brief statement of what is contained in the coal tar industry along with dyes will show in a measure one of the reasons why Germany felt that she could win a war against the world. That she came so desperately close to winning that war is proof of the soundness of her view. In many of the processes are needed the heavy chemicals such as chlorine, sulfuric acid, nitric acid, hydrochloric acid, and the like. The alcohol industry is also of very great importance. Grain alcohol is used extensively in nearly all research problems and in very great quantities in many commercial processes such as the manufacture of artificial silk and for gasoline engines in addition to its use in compounding medicines. It is of very great importance to the chemical warfare service in that from grain alcohol is obtained ethylene gas, one of the three essentials in the manufacture of mustard gas. While this ethylene may be obtained from many sources, the most available source, considering ease of transportation and keeping qualities, is in the form of grain alcohol. Allied to the chemical industries just mentioned is the nitrate industry for making nitric acid from the nitrogen of the air. Nitrates are used in many processes of chemical manufacture and particularly in those for the production of smokeless powders. The fertilizer industry is of large importance because it deals with phosphorus, white phosphorus being not only one of the best smoke-producing materials but a material that is, as stated elsewhere, of great use against men through its powerful burning qualities. Another point not mentioned above in connection with these industries is the training of chemists, chemical engineers, and the building up of plants for the manufacture of chemicals, all of which are necessary sources of supply for wartime needs. Chemists are needed in the field, in the laboratory and in manufacturing plants. The greater their number, the more efficiently can these materials be handled, and since chemicals as such will probably cause more than 50% of all casualties in future wars, their value is almost unlimited. Instead of trying to ameliorate the ravages of war, let us turn every endeavor towards abolishing all war, remembering that the most scientific nations should be the most highly civilized, and the ones most desirous of abolishing war. If those nations will push every scientific development to the point where by the aid of their scientific achievements they can overcome any lesser scientific peoples, the end of war should be in sight. However, we can never be certain that war is abolished until we convince at least a majority of the world that war is disastrous to the conqueror as well as to the conquered. And that any dispute can be settled peacefully if both parties will meet on the common ground of justice and a square deal. Chapter 26. The Future of Chemical Warfare. The pioneer, no matter what the line of endeavor, encounters difficulties caused by his fellow men just in proportion as the thing pioneered promises results. If the promise be small, the difficulties usually encountered are only those necessary to make the venture a success. If, however, the results promise to be great, and especially if the rewards to the inventor and those working with him promise to be considerable, the difficulties thrown in the way of the venture become greater and greater. Indeed, whenever great results are promised, envy is engendered in those in other lines whose importance may be diminished, or who are so short-sighted as to be always opposed to progress. Chemical warfare has had, and is still having, its full share of these difficulties. From the very day when chlorine, known to the world as a benign substance highly useful in sanitation, water purification, gold mining and bleaching was put into use as a poisonous gas, chemical warfare has loomed larger and larger as a factor to be considered in all future wars. Chlorine was first used in the cylinders designed for shipping it. These cylinders were poorly adapted for warfare, and made methods of preparing gas attacks extremely laborious, cumbersome and time-consuming. It was not many months, however, until different gases began to appear in large quantities in shells and bombs, while the close of the war, 3.5 years later, saw the development of gas in solid form whereby it could be carried with the utmost safety under all conditions, a solid which could become dangerous only when the heating mixture, that freed the gas, was properly ignited. While some of the chemicals developed for use in war prior to the armistice have been made known to the world, a number of others have not. More than this, every nation of first-class importance has continued to pursue more or less energetically studies into chemical warfare. These studies will continue, and we must expect that new gases, new methods of turning them loose, and new tactical uses will be developed. Already it is clearly foreseen that these gases will be used by every branch of the Army and the Navy. While chemicals were not used by the air service in the last war, it was even then realized that there was no material reason why they should not have been so used. That they will be used in the future by the air service, and probably on a large scale, is certain. The Navy, too, will use gases, and probably on a considerable scale. Thus chemical materials as such become the most universal of all weapons of war. Some of the poisonous gases are so powerful in minute quantities and evaporate so slowly that their liberation does not produce sufficient condensation to cause a cloud. Consequently, we have gases that cannot be seen. Others form clouds by themselves, such, for instance, as the toxic smoke candle, where the solid is driven off by heating, while still others cause clouds of condensed vapor. This brings the discussion into the realm of ordinary smokes that have no irritating and no poisonous effects. These smokes are extremely valuable where the purpose is to form a screen, whether it be to hide the advance of troops or to cut off the view of observers. These smokes are equally useful on land and on sea. So great is the decrease in efficiency of the rifle or machine gun, and of artillery even when firing at troops that cannot be seen, that smoke for screening purposes will be used on every future field of battle. When firing through a screen of smoke, a man has certainly less than 1/4 the chance to hit his target that he would have were the target in plain view. Since smoke clouds may or may not be poisonous and since smoke will be used in every battle, there is opened up an unlimited field for the exercise of ingenuity in making these smoke clouds poisonous or non-poisonous at will. It also opens up an unlimited field for the well-trained chemical warfare officer who can tell in any smoke cloud whether gas be present and whether, if present, it is in sufficient concentration to be dangerous. At the risk of repetition, it is again stated that there is no gas that will kill or even permanently injure in any quantity that cannot be detected. For every gas, there is a certain minimum amount in each cubic foot of air that is necessary to cause any injury. In nearly all gases, this minimum amount is sufficient to be readily noticeable by a trained chemical warfare officer through the sense of smell. It would be idle to attempt to enumerate the ways and means by which chemicals will be used in the future. In fact, one can hardly conceive of a situation where gas or smoke will not be employed, for these materials may be liquids or solids that either automatically, upon exposure to the air, turn into gas, or which are pulverized by high explosive, or driven off by heat. This varied character of the materials enables them to be used in every sort of artillery shell, bomb or other container carried to the field of battle. Some of the gases are extremely powerful as irritants to the nose and throat in very minute quantities, while at the same time being highly poisonous in high concentrations. Diphenylchloroarsine, used extensively by the Germans in high explosive shell, is more poisonous than phosgene, the most deadly gas in general use in the past war. In addition, it has the quality of causing an intolerable burning sensation in the nose, throat, and lungs, in extremely minute quantities. This material can be kept out of masks only by filters, whereas true gases are taken out by charcoal and chemical granules. There is still another quality which helps make chemical warfare the most powerful weapon of war. Gas is the only substance used in war which can be counted on to do its work as efficiently at night as in the daytime. Indeed, it is often more effective at night than in the daytime, because the man who goes to sleep without his mask on, who is careless, who loses his mask, or who becomes excited in the darkness of night, becomes a casualty. And the past war showed that these casualties were decidedly numerous even when the troops knew almost to the minute the time the gas would arrive. Accordingly, chemical warfare is an agency that must not only be reckoned with by every civilized nation in the future, but is one which civilized nations should not hesitate to use. When properly safeguarded with masks and other safety devices, it gives to the most scientific and most ingenious people a great advantage over the less scientific and less ingenious. Then why should the United States or any other highly civilized country consider giving up chemical warfare? To say that its use against savages is not a fair method of fighting, because the savages are not equipped with it, is arrant nonsense. No nation considers such things today. If they had, our American troops, when fighting the Moros in the Philippine Islands, would have had to wear the breechclout and use only swords and spears. Notwithstanding the opposition of certain people who, through ignorance or for other reasons, have fought it, chemical warfare has come to stay. And just in proportion as the United States gives chemical warfare its proper place in its military establishment, just in that proportion will the United States be ready to meet any or all comers in the future. For the United States has incomparable resources in the shape of the crude materials, power, salt, sulfur and the like, that are necessary in the manufacture of gases. If, then, there be developed industries for manufacturing these gases in time of war, and if the training of the army in chemical warfare be thorough and extensive, the United States will have more than an equal chance with any other nation or combination of nations in any future war. It is just as sportsmanlike to fight with chemical warfare materials as it is to fight with machine guns. The enemy will know more or less accurately our chemical warfare materials and our methods, and we will have the same information about the enemy. It is thus a matching of wits just as much as in the days when the knights of the Round Table fought with swords or with spears on horseback. The American is a pure sportsman and asks odds of no man. He does ask, though, that he be given a square deal. He is unwilling to agree not to use a powerful weapon of war when he knows that an outlaw nation would use it against him if that outlaw nation could achieve success by so doing. How much better it is to say to the world that we are going to use chemical warfare to the greatest extent possible in any future struggle. In announcing that we would repeat as always that we are making these preparations only for defense, and who is there who dares question our right to do so? Index. Absorbance, requirements of testing. Absorptive activity. Absorptive capacity. Aeroplane, smoke screen. American Tizot mask. Ammonia canister. Ammonium chloride smoke. Animals, susceptibility to mustard gas. Anthracite coal, activation of A.R.S. Mask. Arsenic derivatives. Arsenic trichloride, manufacture. Arsenic trifluoride, manufacture. Arsine, proposed use of. Artillery, gas, use of, by. Aviation, gas, use of, by. Baby incendiary bomb. Barrages, gas, use of, in. Benzyl bromide. Benzyl chloride. Burger mixture. Black signal smokes. Black veiling respirator. Blue cross. C diphenylchloroarsine. Blue pencil, German. Bombs, incendiary. Box respirator, American. English. Break point of canisters. Bromocetone. German manufacture. Bromobenzyl cyanide. Bromomethylethyl ketone, German manufacture. Bullets. Incendiary. Camouflage gases. Canister, life of, gas concentration and temperature, effect of. Testing. Carbon dioxide, manufacture. Carbonite. Carbon monoxide. Canister. Manufacture. Cavalry, gas, use of, by. Cement, soda lime. Function in. Charcoal. Active. German. Inactive. Manufacture. Raw material. Substitutes. Tests of. Theory of action. Chemical service section, organization. Chemical warfare, future of. Gases used in. Historical. Officers, duties of. Strategy, relation to. Chemical Warfare Service, Administrative Division. A. E. F. Organization. Development Division. Edgewood Arsenal. Gas Defense Division. Liaison Officers. Medical Division. Organization. Proving Division. Research Division. Training Division. Chemical Warfare Troops. Chenard Bomb. Chlorine. Manufacture. Properties. Chloroacetone. Chloroacetophenone. Chloromethylchloroformate. Chloropicrin. Manufacture. Physiological test. Properties. Protection. Tactical use. Chlorovinyl dichloroarsine. Chlorosulfonic acid, smoke material. Use as. Cloud gas. Coalite. Coconut shell charcoal. Cohewn nut charcoal. Complexine. Horse masks, use in. Cottrell precipitation tube. Darts, incendiary. Density of smoke clouds. Development Division, C. W. S. Dichloroethyl sulfide. Detection. Historical. Manufacture. Mixtures, melting point of. Properties. Tactical use. Toxicity. Vesicant action. Beta dichlorodivinyl chloroarsine. Dihydroxyethyl sulfide. Diphenylchloroarsine. Manufacture. Diphenylcyanorsine. Diphosgene. C-trichloromethyl chloroformate. Dog mask. Donut filter. Dressler tunnel kiln. D-shell. Dugout blankets. Dyes for signal smokes. Edgewood Arsenal, C.W.S. Efficiency test, absorbance. Canisters. Ethyl dichloroarsine. Ethylene, manufacture of. Ethylene chlorhydrin. Ethyl iodoacetate. Explosive dispersion. First gas attack. First gas regiment. Flammenwerfer. Flaming gun. Food. Protection of, against mustard gas. French artillery mask. Gas, defense against. Effectiveness of. Humanity of. Offensive use of. Permanency of. Requirements of. Gas alarms. Gas cloud, height and spread. Smoke in. Gas cylinder. Mobile. Gas Defense Division, C. W. S. Gases, detection of. Peace uses of. Pharmacology. Gas and flame regiment. Gas mask, development. Physiological features. Testing. See also names of various masks. Gas shell, markings. Value. Gassing chamber. Gas training. In France. Value in peace. Gas warfare, fundamentals. Humanity. German mask. Greasine. Green cross shell. Green tea staff. Hand grenade, incendiary. Hanlon field. Hardness, absorbance, test of. Hague Conference, poison gases, action on. Homomartinite. Hopcolite, carbon monoxide absorbent. Horse boots. Horse mask. Humanity, gas warfare. Hypo helmet. Incendiary materials. Tactical use of. Infantry, gas, use of, by. Intelligence section. Interallied gas conference. Irritants, efficiency of. Testing. Ivory nut charcoal. Kieselguhr, soda lime, function in. Cupramite. Lacrimators. Comparative value. Protection. Testing. Lacrimatory shell, tactical value. Lampblack, charcoal from. Lantern test. Mustard gas. Leak detecting apparatus. Leakage, canister, testing of. Levenstein reactor. Lewisite. Liaison officers. Lime, soda lime, function in. Liven's projector. Liven's smoke drum. M2 mask. Man test. Martinite. Mask. Development. Disinfection. Field tests. Issuance. See also gas mask. See also names of masks. Mechanical dispersion. Medical division, C. W. S. Medical section, A. E. F. Methyl dichloroarsine. Moisture, absorbance, tests of. Mustard gas. C. Dichloroethyl sulfide. Navy, canister. Gas, use of, by. Smoke funnel. Nelson cell. 1919, canister. 1919, model American mask. Odors, testing of. Oleum, smoke material, use as. Overall suit. Halite. See chloromethyl chloroformate. Penetration apparatus, toxic smoke, measurement of. P-helmet. pH helmet. Phosgene. Manufacture. Properties. Protection. Shell filling. Tactical use. Phosphorus, smoke material. Stokes mortar, use in. See also smoke. Physiological action, phosgene. Mustard gas. Toxic smokes. Pressure drop apparatus. Protective clothing. Protective gloves. Protective ointments. Proving division, C. W. S. Pumice stone, phosgene shell, use in. Research division, C. W. S. Resistance, canister, test of. Decreased. Respirator, see gas mask, mask. Sag paste. Screening smokes. See also smoke. Screening power, smoke cloud. Selenious acid, mustard gas detector. Shell, gas, filling of. Value. Incendiary. Markings. Pumice stone and phosgene in. Smoke. Ships, screening smoke. Shrapnel, gas in connection with. Signal smokes. Tactics. Silicon tetrachloride, smoke material, use as. Smoke, intensity, measurement of. Tactical value. Use in offense. See also, screening, signal and toxic smokes. Smoke box. Smoke candle. Toxic. Smoke cloud, properties. Smoke drum. Smoke filters. Felt. Paper. Testing. Theory. Smoke funnel. Smoke grenade. Smoke knapsack. Smoke particles. Measurement of. Size of. Smoke screen, purpose of. Smoke shell. Smoke signals. Sneezing gas. See diphenylchloroarsine. Soda lime, composition. Requirements. Sodium hydroxide, soda lime, function in. Sodium permanganate, soda lime, function in. Solid oil. Spray nozzles. Staff troops, C.W.S. Standard box respirator. Stokes mortar. Sulfur chloride, manufacture. Sulfuric acid smoke. Sulfur trioxide, smoke material, use as. Superpolite. See trichloromethyl chloroformate. Tactical use, chloropicrin. Dichloroethyl sulfide. Gases in offense. Incendiary materials. Lacrimatory shell. Phosgene. Screening smokes. Signal smokes. Tactics, chemical warfare and tanks. Smoke screen 4. Thermal dispersion. Thermit, uses. Tin tetrachloride, smoke material, use as Tizot mask. Titanium tetrachloride, smoke material, use as tobacco smoke. Total obscuring power of smoke. Touch method, irritants. Testing of toxicity, gases, testing of 4. Toxic smoke. Candle, B. M. Candle, dispersoid. Penetration. Quantitative relationship. Training division, C.W.S. Trench mortar. Trichloromethyl chloroformate. Trichloronitromethane. C-chloropicrin. Beta, trichlorotrivinylarsine. T-staff. Tyndall meter. Ultramicroscope, smoke particles, measurements of. Vapor tests, irritants, testing of. Versatility of absorbance. Vincenite. Vision chart. Vomiting gas. See chloropicrin. War gas. See gases. War, humanity of. Wave attack, disadvantages. XYL bromide. Yellow cross. See dichloroethyl sulfide. Yellow smoke. Yperite. See dichloroethyl sulfide. Footnotes. This chapter originally appeared in Science, Volume 49, pages 412 to 417, 1919. Popular Science Review, 3, 176, 1864. Trans Royal Scottish SOC. Arts, 4, Appendix O, 198, 1854. In the mixtures the percentages indicate proportions by weight. Succeeded Dr. John Johnson, who went to the National Research Council. At first Lieutenant Colonel J. F. Norris was in charge of all chemical research. About December, 1917, it was divided into offense and defense, and Lieutenant Colonel Lamb was placed in charge of defense. When Colonel Norris went to England as liaison officer, Dr. Jones took his place. At first Lieutenant Colonel J. F. Norris was in charge of all chemical research. About December, 1917, it was divided into offense and defense, and Lieutenant Colonel Lamb was placed in charge of defense. When Colonel Norris went to England as liaison officer, Dr. Jones took his place. At first Lieutenant Colonel J. F. Norris was in charge of all chemical research. About December, 1917, it was divided into offense and defense, and Lieutenant Colonel Lamb was placed in charge of defense. When Colonel Norris went to England as liaison officer, Dr. Jones took his place. In the early organization of the Bureau of Mines, Dr. Yandell Henderson was in charge of the medical sciences. Associated with him were Dr. F. P. Underhill, in charge of therapeutic research, Major M. C. Winternitz, in C of pathological research, and Captain E. K. Marshall in charge of pharmacological research. About May 1, 1918, pharmacological research became so extensive that the section was made into two, with Marshall and Levenhart in charge, while Dr. Hunt was appointed special advisor on pharmacological problems. When the transfer to the War Department was made, Henderson, Underhill, Winternitz and Marshall were transferred to the Medical Division. Lieutenant Colonel McPherson was formerly in charge, and was later transferred to Ordnance. This section was originally under H. H. Clark. Later it was split into two, with Clark and Fogler in charge, and finally consolidated under Ogler. J. INDENG Chemistry, 11, 93, 1919. NC. Is a mixture of 80% chloropicrin and 20% stannic chloride. See The Pathology of War Gas Poisoning, 1920, Yale Press. See Medical Aspects of Mustard Gas Poisoning, 1919, CEO, Mosby Company. Story of the 1st Gas Regiment, James T. Addison. Houghton Mifflin Company, 1919. Norris, J. INDENG Chemistry, 11, 828, 1919. J. A.M. Chemistry Associ 41, 1414, 1919. Norris, J. INDENG Chemistry, 11, 821, September, 1919. J. INDENG Chemistry, 11, 292, 1919. Marshall, Lynch and Smith, J. Pharmacal, 12, 291-301, 1918. J. Pharmacal, 13, 1, 1919. Norris, J. INDENG Chemistry, 11, 825, 1919. Complete details of this work may be found in J. INDENG Chemistry, 12, 213, 1920. So-called triplex glass. J. INDENG Chem. 11, 185, 1919. The basis of this chapter is the series of articles by Lamb and co-workers which appeared in the J. INDENG Chemistry for 1919. Bancroft, J. Phys. Chemistry 24, 127, 201, 342, gives a comprehensive review of charcoal before the war. Part of this section is quoted from Armies of Industry, by Crowell and Wilson, Yale University Press. Which, however, was never used on the battlefield. C. Fieldner and others, J. INDENG Chemistry, 11, 519, 1919. Taken from Fieldner's article mentioned above. While it is a well-known fact that black smoke is not as efficient as white smoke for screening purposes, the reason for this fact is not clear. This ultramicroscope is described in J. A.M. Chem. SOC 41, 312, 1919. Maximum concentration obtainable. 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 This material is adapted from a lecture by General Fries before the students of the General Staff College, in Washington, May 11, 1921. Transcriber's notes. The cover image was created by the transcriber, and is in the public domain. The illustrations have been moved so that they do not break up paragraphs and so that they are next to the text they illustrate. Typographical and punctuation errors have been silently corrected.